Hey guys, tonight we're time travelling into the gilded and grimy world of Queen Elizabeth of Ephesus. On the surface, she's all pearls, ruffles and power, the Virgin Queen, ruler of a global empire and fashion icon of her era. But underneath the satin and symbolism, there is something no royal portrait ever captured. The smell. And oh, it's not good. You might think you've seen some rough hygiene habits on your worst travel day, but trust me, Elizabeth's personal grooming routine could curdle your soup. Tonight we're opening the palace door just a crack, letting the 16th century funk waft in, and following it all the way to the throne, quite literally. You probably won't survive this, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It helps me keep making these unsettling little bedtime dives into history's less fragrant corners. And drop a comment telling me what city you're listening from and what time it is right now. I want to know how close to midnight you're getting with this content. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the myth, the towering idea of Elizabeth I, England's most iconic queen, wrapped in symbolism and silk. She was Gloriana, the radiant ruler untouched by mortal flesh. Everything about her was designed to appear ethereal, but underneath that divine image was a very real, very human woman with a very human body. And that's where things get weird. Because the farther you look behind the throne, the less divine it all smells. Imagine this. You're one of Elizabeth's closest ladies-in-waiting, summoned before sunrise to assist her in the royal bedchamber. You push open the heavy oak doors and immediately hit the wall of scent, an air thick with wax, rosewater, stale linens and something darker underneath. A kind of human musk, too stubborn for perfume. Elizabeth lies under embroidered covers that haven't seen a wash in weeks, maybe months. You don't flinch, because this is normal. It's not that Elizabeth was uniquely disgusting for her time. In fact, she was considered clean by Tudor standards. That's the horrifying part. Her hygiene routine, by her own proud standards, was once a month, whether I need it or not. That's right. One full body bath per month tops, and even that was considered somewhat eccentric, even reckless, because water wasn't trusted. The Tudor belief was that water opened your pores and allowed disease to seep in. Clean skin meant vulnerable skin, so Elizabeth and most of the court preferred to not wash their bodies in water. Instead, they used dry cloths to rub themselves down, scraping away the visible dirt and oil, like one might buff a kitchen counter. It worked about as well as you'd expect. One historical detail, Elizabeth had her own private bath, a stone tub in a tiled chamber, usually filled with warm water mixed with herbs and vinegar. And while this sounds downright luxurious, she didn't use it often. Even the presence of the thing was mostly symbolic, like a gym membership for someone who hates cardio. Now, let's talk scent. You might assume a queen like Elizabeth had access to the best soaps and oils of her time, and she did. She had an entire room filled with perfumes, rosewater, lavender, musk, civet, which is, by the way, extracted from the anal glands of a small cat-like creature. Delightful. Her wardrobe was sewn with sachets of dried flowers and spices. Her gloves were soaked in scent, her wigs were dusted with perfumed powder. She was a walking bouquet, and still, everyone knew. That's the problem with perfume, it doesn't replace bathing. It just dances around the truth, especially in an age before deodorant, before dental floss, before washing machines. Elizabeth's body, and the bodies of everyone around her, were locked in slow olfactory combat with time, sweat and decay. And all the rose petals in the world couldn't win that war. Here's a little quirky tidbit. Elizabeth's court prized orange peels. Ladies would keep dried orange rinds in their sleeved or clutched in handkerchiefs. When the air got too rank, which it often did, they'd lift the peels to their noses and breathe through citrus. A kind of survival snacking, but for nostrils. You had to be proactive. There's an open scholarly debate about just how aware Elizabeth was of her own scent. Some argue she was highly self-conscious and even paranoid about appearing unclean, going so far as to demand her chambermaids change her linen chemise several times a day, even though the rest of her garments might not be cleaned for weeks. Others suggest that, like most people of the time, she had simply normalised the smells. After all, if everyone stinks, who really stinks? But personal hygiene wasn't just about smell, it was about status. A visibly pale, powdered, perfumed monarch was a powerful symbol of distance from the peasantry. Dirt was for farmers, so Elizabeth's efforts to appear above it all, even if it meant wearing the same gown 20 times without a wash, weren't just vanity. They were politics. Washing too much might make her seem common. There's an ironic twist. Staying unclean helped her stay untouchable. And then there's the psychological side. Elizabeth ruled as a woman in a violently male world. Her body was not her own. It was scrutinised, speculated upon, politicised. So maybe this ritual of covering, perfuming and masking every natural function was more than hygiene. Maybe it was armour. Still, none of that helps you when you're standing next to her during a royal procession in July, elbow to elbow with courtiers who also haven't bathed in weeks. The horses are sweating. The crowd is cheering, and Elizabeth, radiant in pearls, is probably sweating through layers of velvet and starch. You smile and nod, but your nose begs for mercy. It's a strange thing, really, to be so revered, so idolised, so completely rank. Elizabeth's public image was spotless, but behind the ruff and rouge was a body doing what bodies do, sweating, decaying, aching, and covering it all was a veil of denial as thick as her powder. The Virgin Queen may have ruled an empire, but her armpit still ruled the room, so you're all still here. Bold move. We're about to lean a little closer, too close really, and take a hard look at the Queen's relationship with bathing. And if you were hoping for a spa day, go ahead and adjust those expectations down. Way down. Because when it came to getting clean, Elizabeth I was less about steam rooms and scented candles, and more about, well, not doing it. At all. Let's just say if there had been a Tudor Yelp review for the royal bathing schedule, it would have gotten one lonely, mildew-covered star. Elizabeth reportedly bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not. And before you imagine some steaming tub full of suds, let's get something straight. This was not a relaxing, bubble-filled ritual with loofahs and lavender. This was more like cautiously dipping yourself into lukewarm, possibly questionable water and hoping it didn't kill you. Water, however, you see, was terrifying in Tudor England. Physicians warned that hot water opened the pores and let sickness seep in. Better to stay dry and dirty than risk a chill that might take you straight to the grave. So even that once-a-month bath? A radical act of queenly bravery. Her bath chamber, a rare royal luxury, was built with stone and lined with tiles, and it did have access to warm water, poured in by exhausted servants who hauled it up bucket by bucket. Sometimes herbs like rosemary or marjoram would be added, along with vinegar, in the hope of making it not only smell nice but ward off disease. But here's the kicker. Elizabeth didn't even use the full bath regularly. More often she preferred sponge baths, dabbing at her body with perfumed cloths and calling it a day. You know that vague feeling after using a wet wipe in place of a shower? Stretch that across a month and you're there. It's not like this was a private decision either. Her household staff was directly involved. One lucky courtier held the title of Groom of the Stool, a job that included monitoring the Queen's linens, helping her dress and undress, and, occasionally supervising her sponge baths. No pressure, right? Just help your monarch delicately dab behind her ears without catching a glimpse of something that might get you fired. Or worse. But here's the weirdest part. By the standards of her time, Elizabeth was clean, a trendsetter, even. The average Tudor subject might bathe once or twice a year. Maybe. A wedding might warrant a fresh scrub. So would a funeral. There's a whole macabre joke to be made about people being cleanest when they were dead. But Elizabeth, in all her powdered glory, went above and beyond with her monthly ritual. Just try to remember that next time you're grossed out by someone skipping a shower, at least they're not doing it in a velvet gown layered over a corset stuffed with whalebone and sweat. Let's paint the picture. It's midsummer in London. The air is thick with horse droppings, human waste, and the metallic stink of the Thames. Inside the palace, you're surrounded by bodies. Tight corsets squeezing sweat through layers of silk, furs trapping heat, and no air conditioning in sight. Elizabeth sits on the throne, elegant, composed, but under her ruff and jewels, her body is absolutely marinating. Her underclothes stick to her skin. She adjusts her skirt discreetly, maybe pats her powdered brow with a scented cloth. And no one says a word because everyone else smells just as bad, or worse. Still, there was a cultural curiosity surrounding bathing. It wasn't entirely unheard of, and in fact public bathhouses had been common in England up until the late Middle Ages. But by Elizabeth's reign, most had been shut down or fallen out of favour. Why? The plague, for one. People started associating public bathing with disease, and the closure of bathhouses was seen as a public health measure. Ironically, this made everyone dirtier. not cleaner. Some nobles kept private bathing chambers, like Elizabeth did, but they were rare and mostly symbolic. Hygiene was performative. The idea of appearing clean through powder, perfume and pristine fabrics mattered more than actually scrubbing down. One strange fringe fact, the court sometimes hosted scenting days. Servants would go through royal rooms with rose water, a citrus peel or vinegar-soaked cloths, wiping surfaces and waving scented fans to refresh the air. Did it work? Barely, but it made everyone feel better, like spraying Febreze on a dumpster and calling it good. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how much of this was Elizabeth's choice and how much was shaped by fear. She was terrified of getting sick, paralysed by the possibility of plague, sweating disease or mysterious humours turning her organs to mush. In her court, cleanliness and health were spiritual matters. To open yourself up to water, to air, to touch was to invite death. So by avoiding full immersion, she was doing what she thought would keep her alive. And let's not forget the optics. The Queen couldn't be seen scrubbing her own back like a common milkmaid. There was something deeply unroyal about manual cleanliness. She had to glide unsullied through the palace, above the mess of mortality. Her body was a symbol. And symbols don't stink. At least not out loud. But back in the real world, Elizabeth's once-a-month bath, cautious and medicinal, was barely enough to stave off the build-up of sweat, oils and the occasional skin condition. And it wasn't like the fabrics she wore helped. Heavy velvet, stiff brocade, and tight corsets didn't breathe. After a few hours under the weight of court dress, the body didn't just perspire, it suffered. No wonder she relied on perfume. The only surprise is that it didn't all go up in a puff of scented smoke. Still, somehow she carried it. All of it. The stink, the weight, the pressure. She performed cleanliness without ever truly feeling clean. And that's the strange, sad glory of Elizabeth I. She ruled with unmatched poise, while silently marinating in her own discomfort. There's a strange comfort in that, isn't there? Even the most powerful woman in Europe had to sit in her own sweat and pretend it didn't exist. So the next time you hesitate before hopping in the shower, just remember, you're already cleaner than a queen. You're still holding on. Impressive. You've now survived 2 rounds of Queen Elizabeth's Tudor hygiene routine, and your reward is more suffering. Or maybe fascination. Is a fine line, because tonight we're cracking open the Queen's royal perfume chest. It's the size of a coffin and probably smelled like one too. You might think fragrance was a delightful indulgence for a monarch with taste, but no. For Elizabeth, perfume wasn't luxury. It was survival. A scented battle cry in a world where bathing was treason and deodorant hadn't even been imagined. Welcome to the rose-scented, musk-drenched war against body odour. Let's be clear, Elizabeth didn't just like her perfume, she relied on it. She had entire rooms set aside for her aromatic arsenal. Bottles of rosewater, lavender oil, marjoram tincture, or even something called spirit of civet, a musky secretion extracted from the backside of the civet cat. Sounds disgusting, that's because it is. And yet it was one of the most prized base notes in the Queen's signature scent. Rich, animalistic, and powerful enough to overpower the worst human odours. That was the point. She wasn't trying to smell like a flower field. She was trying to cancel out the rank undertones of rotting teeth, sour sweat, and damp clothing layered 3 deep with old body oils. This wasn't a spritz-and-go situation. It was chemical warfare. You walk into her chamber, and the air practically whistles with scented particles. Candles laced with clove oil are burning in wall sconces. Her gloves are soaked in rosewater and then rubbed with crushed herbs. A maid gently dusts her collar with violet powder. You can practically taste the perfume on your tongue. It's strong, overwhelming, but you realise that's the point. You're not supposed to smell under the Queen. You're supposed to smell what the Queen wants you to smell, power disguised as petals. And she wasn't just coating herself out of vanity. This was a queen terrified of illness, particularly the plague, which she saw as an airborne invader. The logic of the day claimed that bad smells were a sign and sometimes the cause of disease. Miasma theory, they called it. Foul air makes you sick. So people carried posies, oranges, stuffed with cloves, or tiny metal boxes called pomanders. Elizabeth. She carried the entire garden. Perfume became a type of magical shield, a way to mask not only her body, but the threat of death itself. One strange fact that comes up in court inventories, She owned a set of perfumed fans made from feathers and fine lace, each dipped in various oils. When the court air got particularly ripe, which was often, given the number of unwashed bodies stuffed into a single chamber, she'd wave them with what looked like regal poise. In reality, she was furiously ventilating herself from the collective scent of the aristocracy, a queen flapping away the noble funk. But perfume wasn't just for crisis management, it was a part of daily ritual. Every morning her attendants would present her with a tray of scent options. She'd choose oils for her temples, a powder for her neck, something more musky for her underarms, though again the concept of deodorant was decades away. And then there were her clothes. Every gown and every ruff, every embroidered sleeve was spritzed, soaked, or stuffed with sachets of scent. Because she didn't wash her clothes, God forbid. More on that horror later. For now, just know that perfume had to do the work of a full laundromat, Febreze bottle, and Lysol can all rolled into one. Here's the kicker. No one thought this was strange. Elizabeth's reliance on heavy scent wasn't unusual. It was fashionable. She was just better at it than most. The stench of the average Tudor was legendary, even in its own time. Visitors from cleaner lands, like some parts of Italy or the Ottoman Empire, were horrified. One Italian ambassador noted that the English smelled of raw meat and damp wool. Charming. So when Elizabeth glided past in a wave of clove and civet, people weren't repulsed. They were grateful. Still, the overuse of perfume had consequences. For one, it was heavy. The oils left stains on her gowns, the powders dried out her skin, and the fumes sometimes gave her headaches. Imagine being encased in a cloud of scent so thick it made your eyes water. Every single day. But again, that was the trade-off. Cleanliness was a mirage maintained by olfactory illusion. The idea was to keep the illusion strong enough that no one noticed the reality sweating just beneath the surface. And there's a more subtle danger, the way scent shaped perception. Elizabeth built an empire of smell. She wanted to be remembered as a divine presence, almost otherworldly, and fragrance helped her craft that image. When you approached her, you weren't just seeing royalty, you were breathing her. Her scent lingered in the halls long after she left, like an invisible signature. Foreign diplomats were struck by it. Ladies in waiting mentioned it in letters. Even her enemies couldn't help but notice the intoxicating perfume that preceded her entrance. She weaponized fragrance the way others used armies. There's an interesting academic debate about whether her perfume obsession came from insecurity. Some scholars argue she feared being exposed as mortal, aging, sweating, imperfect, especially as she got older and her physical beauty began to fade. The perfume became a mask, one she could control. Others suggest it was a genuine attempt to connect with her subjects, to give them something memorable, even pleasant, to associate with her presence. A way to distract from the smell of the rest of court life, which was, let's be honest, somewhere between farmyard and fish market. But there's one fringe belief that's especially fun. Some herbalists of the time thought heavy perfume could actually close the pores, effectively sealing the body from external harm. So Elizabeth's layers of oil, powder and scent weren't just about masking. Some thought they were medicinal, like a human Tupperware lid. Weird, but in a world where bloodletting was still trending, it kind of tracks. And so the Queen continued year after year, layering scent upon scent, turning herself into a walking potion bottle. It worked, sort of. She kept the illusion alive. Her courtiers bowed, her enemies flinched, her people adored her. But under it all, the Queen was human, tired, sweaty, smelling faintly of violets, decay and desperation. It's funny how scent lingers. Hundreds of years later, you can still find references to Elizabeth's perfume in archives and letters. But no recipe survives exactly. No one knows her exact formula. Just that it was overpowering, unforgettable, and absolutely necessary. The final flourish in a daily performance of cleanliness that was anything but clean. So next time you spritz yourself with something floral, give a nod to Elizabeth. She walked so your body spray could run, and trust me, it's still an upgrade. Let's talk about the teeth. Yeah, we're going there. You've braved the sweat, the rosewater, and the sponge baths. Now it's time to peer into the royal mouth. Don't worry, I'll be gentle, but I won't lie to you. Queen Elizabeth's teeth were, by most accounts, a nightmare. Think dark, decayed, aching, and visibly blackened, in portraits painted late in her life. If you're the kind of person who winces at a dentist's drill, brace yourself, because the Virgin Queen's dental hygiene will make you grateful for every toothbrush you've ever owned. First, you need to remember that sugar was a luxury in Tudor England, one of those rare imports only the wealthy could afford. So naturally, Elizabeth had it in abundance. She was obsessed with sweets, especially candied violets and preserved fruits. Her palace kitchens were rumoured to produce intricate sugar sculptures that doubled as edible art. And she didn't just dabble, this woman feasted on sugar. That might sound like a dream, but in a world without toothpaste or floss, it was a molar-melting disaster. By the time she was in her 40s, Elizabeth had lost several teeth, and the ones that remained had turned a dark, almost bluish black. Chronic toothaches plagued her court life. Diplomats noted how she avoided smiling in public during her later years, not because she wasn't pleased, but because her teeth were too embarrassing to reveal. Imagine ruling an empire while trying not to laugh too hard for fear your royal chompers might fall out mid-sentence. Now, to be fair, dental hygiene wasn't really a thing yet. People believed in scraping their teeth with small sticks or wiping them with cloth soaked in vinegar, but there was no such thing as brushings, and no one really understood plaque. Elizabeth did have access to toothpicks, often ornately carved from silver or ivory. She was known to carry one in a jewelled case, more for show than for serious cleaning. It helped her dislodge bits of food, sure, but it didn't save her from the rot. And unfortunately, what passed for toothpaste back then included ingredients like burnt rosemary, ground eggshells, and even powdered brick. Yeah, you could practically hear your enamel crying. One grim historical fact: at one point Elizabeth suffered such severe dental pain that her courtiers had to sneak behind her back to bring in a doctor. She had refused treatment 4 weeks, afraid of the pain and the embarrassment. Her courtiers, worried the Queen might die of infection, resorted to a bit of trickery. They convinced a bishop to undergo a tooth extraction in front of her, just to prove it wasn't that bad. The bishop complied, possibly against his will, and had a perfectly healthy tooth yanked out while Elizabeth watched. Did it work? Kind of. She eventually agreed to have a rotten tooth removed. That's right. It took a staged dental drama and a brave clergyman's sacrifice to get her to face the forceps. But here's the twist. Black teeth weren't just tolerated in Elizabeth's court. They became fashionable. Because sugar was expensive, having stained or decayed teeth signalled wealth. People started rubbing soot on their own teeth to mimic the Queen's. Imagine a world where oral decay becomes a flex. Oh, this! It's not gangrene, it's luxury. It's a weird kind of devotion, right? But when your queen glows with pearls and radiates power, even while slowly losing her smile, people follow the lead. And then there's the scholarly debate about how much of her tooth decay was actually visible, versus how much was whispered about in ambassador reports and later gossip. Some believe her portraits were deliberately altered to hide her dental issues. The few paintings that show her smiling are either early works or so idealised they border on cartoonish. So we're left with second-hand reports and diary entries, like those from French envoys who described her as elegant, commanding, and possessed of unsightly black teeth. Oof! And while Elizabeth had doctors, plenty of them, they weren't exactly helpful. The royal physicians didn't believe in germs or infection the way we do. Their treatments often made things worse, bleeding, poultices, and herbal mouth rinses that probably did nothing except make her breath more fragrant as her gums quietly rotted away. There were no antibiotics, no dental anaesthesia. Just grit your teeth or what's left of them, and hope for the best. Quirky fact time. One remedy of the era involved rinsing with wine and then chewing on sugarcane to stimulate the gums. Yes. They tried to cure sugar-related decay with more sugar. That's like treating sunburn with a tanning bed. And if that didn't work, there were options like clove oil, powdered coral, or, if you were feeling particularly experimental, ashes of burnt mice. This is not me being dramatic. That was an actual prescription in one 16th century apothecary manual, and yet despite the pain and decay, Elizabeth never let it slow her down. She conducted long court sessions, hosted ambassadors, gave rousing speeches, and maintained absolute control of her image. She may have been suffering from a mouthful of misery, but she didn't flinch in public. She just clenched her jaw, powdered her face, and kept ruling like a woman who would rather die than show weakness, or halitosis. And really, that's the ultimate horror here. Not the smell, not the rot, but the commitment. Elizabeth built her reign on symbolism. She had to be perfect, immaculate, eternal, untouched. Her real body, with its bleeding gums and decaying teeth, couldn't exist in public. So she hid it, masked it, perfumed it, and posed through it. even when her mouth betrayed her, she never let the Empire see her flinch. So the next time you reach for floss and feel lazy, think of Elizabeth trying to manage an empire while her molars slowly dissolved. Think of her chewing candied violets through clenched pain, politely waving her perfumed fan while her breath could melt glass. Think of her smiling, just barely, and inspiring a whole kingdom to paint their teeth black in solidarity, and then thank your lucky stars for toothbrushes, dentists, and the sweet mercy of Novocaine. Let's get into the face, specifically the Queen's face. The portraits tell one story: alabaster skin, smooth and radiant, as if carved from moonlight. But the reality is more like a slow-motion chemical peel happening over decades, because Queen Elizabeth I wasn't just pale by accident. That icy glow was the direct result of her favourite beauty product, Venetian ceruse. Sounds elegant, right? Like something you'd find in a fancy French boutique. In truth, it was lead, actual lead, mixed with vinegar, and she smeared it all over her face day after day, year after year. It's hard to overstate just how obsessed Elizabeth was with maintaining that ghostly white appearance. In the 16th century, pale skin was the ultimate flex. It meant you were above labour. Untouched by sun or soil, it meant you were noble, elite, untouchable. A tan, on the other hand, marked you as a peasant, someone who worked outdoors and sweated for a living. So the Queen, who already ruled by image, leaned into this hard. She powdered her skin until it gleamed like porcelain, and the whiter it got, the more powerful she looked. But beneath that shimmer, her skin was quietly falling apart. Venetian ceruse was marketed as a miracle. It could cover blemishes, scars, or even the natural texture of skin. It created an unbroken porcelain mask, but it also slowly poisoned the user. Lead seeps into the skin, into the bloodstream, and over time it does horrible things. Hair loss, stomach pain, mood swings, and oh yes, skin corrosion. So the longer Elizabeth used it, the more her skin suffered. And the more her skin suffered, the more she covered it up with thicker and thicker layers of ceruse. You see the problem here? It was a vicious cycle of rot and illusion. The tipping point came after she contracted smallpox in 1562. She survived, but the illness left her face marked with deep pox scars. For a queen whose identity was practically glued to her image, this was devastating. So she leaned even harder into the makeup. What had once been a beauty trick became a kind of armour, a plastered mask designed to protect her, not just from judgment, but from the very idea of mortality. Her courtiers noted how she increasingly appeared only in low light, her face bathed in candle glow, with her cheeks so rouged and powdered that it seemed less like a person and more like a figurehead. And it wasn't just the ceruse. She layered on rouge made from cinnabar, a mercury-based pigment that was just as toxic. Her eyebrows were drawn in with soot or crushed berries. Her lips were tinted with a mixture that included red lead, a substance so corrosive it could cause nerve damage with enough exposure. Basically, her entire face became a chemical battlefield, and yet no one dared say a word. Here's a weird side note. Elizabeth's ceremonial makeup routine was treated with the same gravity as a royal audience. She didn't apply it herself. It was a team effort. Her ladies-in-waiting would mix the ceruse fresh, using mortar and pestle, and then apply it in careful layers while the Queen sat still, her face tilted toward the light. It was ritualistic, a mask being built stroke by stroke, and when it dried, her skin would feel tight, almost brittle, like eggshell. She could barely smile without cracking it, which conveniently helped hide the missing teeth. There's an open debate among historians about whether Elizabeth understood what the ceruse was doing to her. Some argue she couldn't have known it was toxic. Others point out that signs of lead poisoning were fairly well known at the time, though not entirely understood. The fact that her symptoms, tremors, chronic headaches, irritable behaviour lined up with exposure probably didn't go unnoticed. But stopping? That wasn't an option. Not for a queen whose power depended on perfection. She was the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, untouched by time. Admitting decay meant admitting weakness. So she pressed on, layer after layer. By the end of her life, Elizabeth's makeup had become inseparable from her identity. She would not be seen without it. In her final years, she refused to look in mirrors and barred anyone from entering her chambers uninvited. Her face had become a mask she couldn't remove, a kind of armour against the ageing that was quietly, inexorably happening beneath. And it was working, at least in the public eye. Her subjects continued to worship her image. They saw the pale glow, the ruby lips, the commanding gaze. No one knew how much of it was illusion, or how much pain it cost to maintain, and that brings us to one of the most fringe, eyebrow-raising facts of the whole story. Elizabeth's carouse, when removed, would sometimes take skin with it. That's right. The paste was so caustic that when she washed it off, assuming she did at all, it could leave patches of raw, irritated skin. One account suggests she began layering cloth beneath the powder to minimise the damage, essentially bandaging her face before she painted it. Again, no one said a word. You'd think someone would step in, a doctor maybe, a concerned noble. But the Queen's control over her court was absolute. No one criticised her appearance, ever. Doing so wasn't just rude, it was dangerous. Her appearance wasn't about beauty anymore, it was about sovereignty. She had to look eternal, or the illusion of divine monarchy would shatter. In a very real way, her face was England, and so the mask held even as her health declined. Her skin became dry and brittle, her cheeks hollowed, but the white glow stayed strong. When foreign dignitaries met her, they still described her as luminous, because that's what she intended, because she had built an empire of powder and poison and willpower. It's tragic, really. The most powerful woman in Europe reduced to a prisoner inside a mask she made herself. The very thing meant to make her look invincible was slowly eating her alive, and yet she couldn't stop. She wouldn't. The mask had to stay on, because without it she feared she might disappear entirely. So the next time you slap on some concealer or feel annoyed at your morning routine, remember Elizabeth, sitting perfectly still in a velvet chair, letting her ladies layer her skin with poison, because the alternative, being seen as mortal, was worse than death. And then maybe thank your skincare routine, because your face wash isn't made of vinegar and lead, and your glow is probably not radioactive. Now, if you're still with me, and honestly, at this point, you deserve a medal, we're going to lift the lid on one of Elizabeth's most iconic features, her hair. Or more precisely, the illusion of hair. Because what the portraits show, a glorious fiery crown of curls, is, let's say, aspirational. By her mid-30s, Elizabeth's real hair had thinned significantly, and by her later years, it was likely almost entirely gone. The reasons? Stress, illness, lead poisoning from her makeup, and good old-fashioned Tudor hygiene, or lack thereof. The solution? Wigs, piles of them, carefully crafted, heavily powdered, and possibly crawling with secrets. Let's set the scene. You're back in her royal chambers, and it's early morning. The Queen has just emerged from her bed. Not that she slept much, because she rarely did. And it's time to begin the transformation. One of her ladies-in-waiting brings forward a stand on which rests her chosen wig for the day. Auburn curls, painstakingly arranged, and possibly scented with lavender. It's thick, majestic, and regal. Thing like the actual scalp it will be hiding. Elizabeth reportedly had over 80 wigs, each one styled to reflect different moods and occasions. Some were light and tight for daytime affairs, others were larger, more theatrical, meant for banquets or diplomatic showdowns. They were made from real human hair, sometimes horsehair, and occasionally wire or padding to hold shape. All of them were labour-intensive and probably uncomfortable. Imagine wearing a helmet made of hair in a palace with no air conditioning, and an ambient temperature somewhere between toasty and slow bake. Now, let's get real about what might have been under those wigs. Hygiene standards being what they were, her scalp was likely not a clean, airy paradise. Without regular washing, or any washing, wig wearers of the time risked a whole buffet of problems, scalp infections, rashes, and of course lice. Lice were practically considered roommates in Tudor households. People didn't ask if you had them, they just assumed you did and moved on. And wigs were prime real estate for these little blood-sucking tenants. Elizabeth would have relied on combs soaked in vinegar or rosewater to delouse both her natural hair, what was left of it, and the wigs themselves. And if you're wondering whether that worked, the answer is sort of. It masked the problem more than solved it. Some historians think her wigs were regularly boiled or aired out near the fire to kill off vermin. Others suspect her ladies simply brushed the wigs, powdered them, perfumed them, and put them right back in rotation. That lavender scent? Probably carrying more than just floral notes. There's a quirky detail here. The powdered look we associate with wigs wasn't just a style choice. The powder, usually starch or crushed bone, was meant to dry out oils, mask smells, and suffocate lice. So when you see Elizabeth looking perfectly coiffed with that pale cloud over her curls, you're not seeing elegance, you're seeing pest control in real time. But her hair wasn't just about appearance, it was part of her brand. That bold red, often enhanced with henna or dye, tied her symbolically to her father Henry VIII and to the Tudor lineage. Red hair was rare and carried a mystique. It set her apart visually, and Elizabeth knew the power of a good visual. Her wigs weren't just wigs. They were crowns in disguise, extensions of the myth she lived every day. Still, that myth came with a cost. By the end of her life, Elizabeth refused to be seen without full regalia, which included her elaborate wig and makeup. Her maids were reportedly forbidden to catch her without it. If one did, she could be dismissed immediately. This wasn't vanity in the casual sense, it was survival. The queen without her mask, without her hair, without her polish, was not the queen. She was mortal. And mortality had no place on the throne. Some scholars argue that this obsession with maintaining her image was driven not just by pride, but by political necessity. She was aging in a world that didn't tolerate female power without beauty. As long as she looked radiant, untouched by age or time, she could hold back the tide. Her wig was more than a fashion accessory, it was armour. But let's not pretend everyone was fooled. By her 60s, foreign ambassadors described her as a shadow of her former self. Her hands veiny, her face rigid, her movements slow. One even described her wig slipping slightly during a conversation, revealing patches of bare, irritated scalp. No one commented, of course. What could they say? "Excuse me, Your Majesty, your illusion is showing." Not unless they had a death wish. And yet she carried on. Every day, she sat before the mirror, sometimes for hours, while her team carefully layered her transformation. Her wig was brushed, fluffed, powdered, pinned. Sometimes fresh flowers were added, sometimes little pearls, and then, like clockwork, she rose, taller and more formidable than before, as if none of the hidden decay existed. She didn't just wear a wig, she became the wig. It was the finishing touch in her daily resurrection. There's one final eerie note here. After her death in 1603, Elizabeth was laid out in state with all her regalia, including her wig. The same image she'd spent decades perfecting was the one displayed to her people in the end. And when the wig was finally removed, some sources claim her scalp was mottled and raw, nearly bald. The damage from years of adhesives, powders, dyes and neglect had taken its toll. But no one mourned the reality. They mourned the symbol, the glowing red-haired monarch who had defied age, gender, and biology. The mask had become the woman. So now, picture her, stepping out into the court, every strand of that wig in place, her chin lifted, her perfume heavy in the air, and not a soul daring to question what lay beneath. That's not just dedication, that's something close to magic. Dark, lead-dusted, lavender-scented magic. And maybe next time you complain about a bad hair day, you'll remember Elizabeth, strapping on her own personal hair furnace, dabbing her scalp with vinegar, and ruling an empire with a head full of secrets. All right, we've danced around the surface smells, sweat powder, perfume, but now it's time to go deeper, much deeper, right down to the facilities. Because behind the Queen's dazzling gowns and cloud of rosewater was a truth no one likes to think about. Every human body has to go. Yes, even the Queen of England. And let me tell you, Tudor plumbing didn't do anyone any favours. Tonight, we're pulling back the velvet curtain on Elizabeth IV's bathroom situation, or lack thereof, and it's intimate, to say the least. Let's start with Sussex. Elizabeth didn't have a toilet as we know it. She had what's charmingly referred to as a close stool. Sounds dainty, right? Like something you'd perch on with a book and a cup of tea. But no, it's basically an upholstered wooden box with a padded lid and a chamber pot inside. Imagine a fancy chair with a hole in the middle, under which sat a removable bowl, usually made of pewter, ceramic, or sometimes silver if you were feeling royal. It was portable, discreet, and deeply unsanitary by modern standards. Now, the Queen's close stool wasn't just practical, it was ceremonial. It had tassels, it had embroidery, and it had a designated servant. That's right. There was a courtier whose official title was Groom of the Stool, and his job, his actual paid profession, was to assist the Queen with her private bodily functions. This was considered a position of extreme trust and privilege. After all, If someone's going to see you at your most vulnerable, you'd better make sure they're loyal. The groom of the stool helped with clothing, ensured privacy, managed the disposal of waste, and probably dealt with smells that could peel the paint off the palace walls. Now imagine this scene. Elizabeth, layered in yards of stiffened silk and whalebone corsets, gives a subtle nod. The chambermaids clear out. The close stool is rolled in. The room grows quiet. No plumbing, no flushing, no hand soap waiting nearby. When she's finished, the groom removes the bowl and hands it off to a servant, who carries it away, probably down the back stairwell, to be dumped into a cesspit, a moat, or in some cases, just the nearest patch of dirt. London was, shall we say, well fertilised. There's no evidence Elizabeth ever used a privy built into the palace walls. Those existed, sort of tiny closet-like spaces with a bench and a chute leading into the moat. But they stank constantly, were magnets for disease, and were shared by multiple people. No thank you. The Queen preferred her custom stool, kept in her private chambers, emptied frequently, and this is key, perfumed. The chamber pot would often be rinsed with rosewater, or the stool itself would be lined with herbs like lavender, thyme, or mint in a futile attempt to fight the inevitable. Now here's the part that might surprise you. These toilet rituals weren't hidden or shameful. They were part of court life, not discussed openly maybe, but accepted. Bodily functions weren't seen through our modern lens of privacy and an embarrassment. Elizabeth's ability to control her body, even in this very human way, was considered a reflection of her discipline and majesty. If she managed to do it all while looking regal and not breaking a sweat, even better. Still, the smell was impossible to ignore. Despite constant airing, perfuming, and linen changes, her chambers would have carried the unmistakable aroma of unplumbed life. Her mattress was stuffed with straw and rarely changed. Her floors, though often swept, weren't mopped. And when chamber pots spilled, which they sometimes did, it wasn't just unpleasant. It was dangerous. Germ theory didn't exist yet, but people knew enough to associate foul odours with sickness. The Queen was surrounded by people working tirelessly to keep the illusion of cleanliness intact, even as the reality sat just under her skirt. Let's pause for a moment on the psychology of this. Elizabeth was famously controlling. She micromanaged her court, her image, her correspondence. But in this one aspect, this one fundamentally human aspect, she had to surrender. Someone else was always present, always aware. It's a level of vulnerability most of us can't fathom. The simple act of relieving herself was a production involving hierarchy, loyalty, and layers of performance. There was no such thing as privacy in the royal court. Just a performance of decorum, even in the most indecorous moments. A strange fringe detail. Some Tudor close stools had compartments for dried petals or crushed herbs that released fragrance when the lid closed. Basically, the 16th century version of a scent diffuser built into your bathroom chair. There's no record of Elizabeth's model specifically having this feature, but given how scent-obsessed her household was, it's not a stretch. It would have been both practical and symbolic, a throne upon a throne, if you will. There's scholarly debate over how often the Queen used the stool versus simply waiting or limiting her intake during long public events. Some suggest she developed an almost superhuman ability to hold it during audiences, procession, and ceremonies. Others argue that courtiers were so practiced in shielding her movements that we simply don't have the records to know. What we do know is this. The Queen's stool, just like her wigs and carews, was part of the machinery that maintained her image. Even her most basic human needs were managed with symbolic polish. And yet, the longer you think about it, the more human it all becomes. The Queen, tucked away in her richly scented chamber, sitting on a velvet-lined box, surrounded by loyal attendants pretending nothing was happening. A monarch, yes, but still a body, still flesh, still vulnerable to the same smells, leaks, and awkward timings as anyone else. In the end, the stool might be the most revealing artifact of her reign. Not the crown, not the sword, not the glittering gowns. That wooden box, sitting quietly by the bedchamber wall, says it all. A symbol of royalty and mortality tangled together, elevated by tassels and rosewater, sure, but never truly separate from the real, messy, human truth underneath. So next time you use a restroom with running water and a door that locks, whisper a quick thank you to modern plumbing, and maybe light a candle in honour of Elizabeth's groom of the stool, who truly earned every shilling. So far, you've sniffed your way through Elizabeth's makeup drawer, crawled under her wigs and endured the up-close reality of the royal close stools. But now it's time to meet some of the Queen's most persistent and unwelcome courtiers, her lice. Yes, lice. The tiny six-legged freeloaders who thrived in the warm folds of unwashed linen, the seams of her elaborate gowns, and the very hairpieces she wore to dazzle the world. If you thought ruling an empire was hard, try doing it while constantly scratching your scalp under a £30 velvet wig. Lice were a fact of life in the 16th century, not just for the peasants or soldiers, but for kings and queens. These weren't the kind of guests you could kick out with a good shampoo and a hot shower, because as you now know, Elizabeth didn't bathe, and she certainly didn't strip down and scrub her scalp every week, which meant that once the lice moved in, they made themselves comfortable. They laid eggs, they built little itchy dynasties. They became, in effect, her most loyal and least respected entourage. Now, let's be clear, Elizabeth's hygiene rituals attempted to combat this. She owned ornate combs made of ivory and silver, carved with obsessive detail. These were passed through her wigs and what remained of her natural hair, often dipped in vinegar or herbal mixtures designed to purge the head of vermin. The process was time-consuming and it didn't always work, because even if you managed to comb out a few adult lice, their eggs, nits, would cling to the fibres of her wigs and linens. And given the Queen's aversion to laundering clothes, we'll get to that mess soon, it's not hard to imagine those critters simply taking a brief vacation before crawling right back in. A weird little historical fact: Elizabeth sometimes wore tightly fitted linen coifs beneath her wigs. Think of them like soft caps that covered her head and acted as a barrier. These coifs could absorb sweat, cushion the weight of her wigs, and ideally keep her scalp cleaner. But they were rarely washed either, and over time they became just another habitat, a mobile lice hotel with royal decor, and these weren't the only bugs in play. Fleas too were part of everyday court life. Royal rooms were rarely aired out, the bedding was stuffed with straw and food was everywhere. Banquets meant crumbs, and crumbs meant pests. The Queen's attendants would dust her mattress with herbs like tansy, pennyroyal, and wormwood, not because they smelled nice, they didn't, but because they were believed to repel insects. In theory, Elizabeth slept in a nest of anti-flea foliage. In practice, it probably made her bedroom smell like an overgrown garden, and did little to stop the critters. There's a fringe belief that Elizabeth occasionally used mercury-based skin salves, not for beauty, but to combat parasites. Yes, mercury. The same stuff that slowly poisons your nervous system. While there's no direct record of her applying it herself, apothecaries of the time routinely prescribed it for lice and scabies. It would be rubbed into the scalp or skin, allowed to sit, and then wiped away, assuming the patient didn't pass out from the fumes first. So if Elizabeth did use these methods, it might explain some of the mood swings her contemporaries whispered about. What's particularly cruel is how all of this tied back into her public image. Elizabeth had to present herself as perfect, divine, untouched. She had to glide across the palace like a ghost made of silk, but under that image her scalp itched, her coif scratched, and her patients probably wore thin more often than history admits. Picture it. The Queen mid-council, surrounded by advisors trying not to flinch as something crawls along her neckline. You can almost hear the internal scream, and let's not pretend she didn't know. Everyone knew. Lice were common. So common, in fact, that etiquette manuals offered polite ways to remove them in public. Think about that. There were entire sections on how to discreetly scratch, pick, or pinch lice off your neighbour during a meal. In a world where no one smelled good and most people had bugs, subtlety was a virtue. But Elizabeth couldn't just pick at her scalp during dinner. She had to sit still and glowing, the embodiment of grace. Her attendants, however, could act on her behalf. They might gently adjust her wig or touch up her powder while subtly tending to the problem beneath. Nothing was said. The court turned a blind eye. It was easier that way. One scholar described Elizabeth's court as a pageant of suppression, a place where discomfort, illness, and even infestation were swallowed behind stiff smiles and tighter corsets. The Queen couldn't afford to be human, and so even as her skin itched and her body rebelled, she remained composed. But surely when she was finally alone, when the wig was off, the bodice unlaced, and the chambermaid dismissed, she must have really let out a sigh of pure, exhausted discomfort. And you know what? That's kind of beautiful. Not the lice. Those are still awful. But the endurance. The ability to hold composure, to maintain an empire, all while crawling under your own crown. It's absurd, it's troic, it's impressive. There's something profoundly human about that kind of discomfort, the little indignities we all endure and never speak about. Elizabeth just had to do it in ruffs and gowns while a continent watched. Her legend was spotless, but her scalp definitely wasn't. So next time you feel an itch, and your first reaction is to panic, remember, it could be worse. You could be a queen in a powdered wig, pretending not to notice the tiny battalion waging war on your scalp while a French ambassador asks about naval funding. And if you ever find yourself picking at your hair in public, just do it with regal flair. Because if Elizabeth could endure the crawl of royalty, you can survive your Monday meeting. Okay, you've made it through the hair, the bugs, the bodily functions, and the makeup that could have been used to paint a boat hull. So let's slide into something deceptively elegant now. The Queen's wardrobe. I know, it sounds harmless. Pretty even. Sparkling jewels, yards of brocade, pearl-encrusted collars. But here's the nightmare hiding beneath the satin. Elizabeth almost never washed her clothes. Not her gowns, not her petticoats, not even most of the underlayers. She wore them again and again, sometimes for weeks at a time. And no, the concept of Febreze had not yet arrived. Now, before you start imagining her skipping around in a musty ball gown like a moth in human form, let's give this some context. Laundry in the Tudor era wasn't just a chore. It was a dangerous, labour-intensive process. Clothes were scrubbed with lye, soaked in boiling water, pounded on stones, and hung outside to dry in smoke-filled air. Fine fabrics couldn't withstand that kind of abuse. Silk, velvet, and lace would simply disintegrate. So instead of washing, Elizabeth opted for rotation. She had dozens, maybe hundreds of gowns in her wardrobe, each one custom-made, each one a masterpiece, and most of them never saw water. The outer layers, especially the gowns and overrobes, were rarely cleaned. Instead, her ladies-in-waiting would air them out by hanging them in the breeze, patting them with cloths dipped in rosewater, and sometimes brushing them with small instruments designed to lift dirt and revive texture. Picture it like dry cleaning a bourse, but with herbs and a whole lot of wishful thinking. If a gown started to smell too strong, even by Tudor standards, it might be retired for a while. But more often than not, it went right back into circulation with a fresh dusting of lavender sachets sewn into the seams, and underneath those gowns, layers, so many layers. A typical royal outfit included a chemise, an underdress made of linen, one or more petticoats, a farthingale, that hoop skirt contraption to give the gown its shape, a kirtle, a sort of fitted underdress, and then the outer gown itself. Each of these was designed not just for modesty and fashion, but to absorb sweat, oils, and, let's be honest, a fair bit of body odour. But here's the kicker. Even the chemises weren't washed daily, sometimes not even weekly. Elizabeth reportedly had her linen underthings changed more often than most of her contemporaries, possibly once every couple of days, but washing them still involved boiling, bleaching, and beating. It was exhausting, costly, and destructive to fabric. So unless something was visibly soiled, it stayed in use. One fringe fact, Elizabeth's wardrobe was so massive and tightly guarded that her mistress of the robes essentially acted as a personal curator. There was an entire room, like a proto-museum, where her gowns were stored, inventoried, and meticulously arranged. And they weren't just clothing, they were propaganda. Each one carefully selected for its colour symbolism, religious references, national pride, or message to a visiting ambassador. The Queen wore scarlet to represent power, white for virginity, black for mourning or defiance. But under all that symbolism, dirt, sweat, old perfume, and sometimes fleas. And still, she never appeared dishevelled. Her gowns were stiff with structure and embellishment, literally too rigid to wrinkle. They held their shape whether she was fresh or filthy, which, honestly, is kind of genius. If you can't smell someone through 30 layers of brocade, did they even stink? The irony, of course, is that the richer the fabric, the more it trapped odour. Velvet is beautiful, but practically a sponge for human scent. Silk? It absorbs everything, including the oils from your skin and the smoke from palace fires. The Queen's court was full of candles, incense, burning hearths, and the general musk of hundreds of bodies packed into windowless rooms. The clothes soaked it up like a sponge. And then the Queen put those same clothes right back on the next day. There's also a darker angle to all this. The effort to maintain her royal image came at the expense of her comfort. Those tight corsets and high ruffs weren't just annoying, they were restrictive. Elizabeth often stood for hours during public events, sometimes nearly fainting from the heat and pressure of her gowns, but taking them off or appearing in a state of undress even slightly wasn't an option. Her power was in the performance, and that performance required layers. Stiff, unwashed perfume layers that clung to her body like a second sweaty skin. Historians still debate just how many of these gowns were ever cleaned, and how thoroughly. Some argue that while the outer robes were treated with care, the linen underlayers were likely rotated more often than we think, especially during the Queen's younger, more active years. Others believe that Elizabeth, especially later in life, became increasingly reluctant to part with her favourite pieces, wearing them far longer than was practical. Her vanity and fear of illness may have led her to avoid unnecessary contact with water or laundresses. There are reports of garments being aired for weeks before she'd wear them again, as if she hoped time alone would erase the smell of life lived in brocade. Another quirky twist: the use of starch. Elizabeth adored heavily starched ruffs and cuffs, the kind that could slice bread if angled right. These were dipped in a thick paste of flour and water, shaped over forms and dried until rigid. But starch, when mixed with sweat and heat, could start to smell, let's say, yeasty, and not in a pleasant bakery sort of way. So on top of everything else, the Queen might have smelled faintly like old sourdough by the end of a long day on the throne, and yet she kept up the illusion. She moved through the court with grace, her sleeves billowing, her train trailing behind her, carrying with it an invisible wake of rosewater and human evidence. No one questioned it. No one dared. Because this wasn't just fashion, it was a spell, a carefully crafted vision of untouchable beauty, stitched together with pearls and sweat. So the next time you toss your shirt into the laundry basket after a single wear, remember Elizabeth reclining in a chair stuffed with old straw, wrapped in unwashed velvet, adjusting a ruff as stiff as her spine, smelling faintly of lavender, starch and thyme. Because back then clothes didn't just make the monarch, they were the monarch, stains and all. We've talked about the clothes, the perfumes and all the layers of powdered illusion, but tonight, let's step inside the Queen's most private space, her bedchamber. On the surface, it was a room of extraordinary grandeur, dripping with tapestries, thick curtains, carved wooden panels, and gilded accents that glinted softly by candlelight. But if you're picturing a serene lavender-scented retreat, think again. Elizabeth's bedchamber was beautiful, yes, but behind the silk and pomp, it was a humid little cave of trapped odours slowly marinating in the evidence of unwashed bodies, stale linens, and royal fear. Imagine walking into that room. The air is heavy, not stinking exactly, but dense. It's a stew of old rosewater, waxy candles, musty cloth, the metallic edge of chamber pots, and the earthy tang of human sweat that no amount of lace doilies can disguise. The windows are small and often closed, because drafts were believed to bring sickness. The fireplace provides heat, sure, but it also fills the room with smoke and the faint aroma of damp, smouldering wood. Now toss in a few dozen people milling around, maids, messengers and royal attendants, and you've got the scent profile of a high-end barn. But this wasn't just any bedroom. The Queen's bedchamber was the heart of her daily ritual. Mornings began with the lever, a ceremonial waking during which Elizabeth was gently roused, washed, with cloths, not water, and dressed by her ladies-in-waiting. It was a performance, often with favoured courtiers watching from the sidelines like some exclusive backstage pass. The room had to smell right, look right, and function under pressure, except it rarely smelled as fresh as the Queen's carefully selected persona. Because no matter how many flower sachets they tucked into the mattress, or how much rose oil they rubbed into the bedpost, there's no hiding decades of human funk without regular cleaning. And that bed? Let's talk about the bed. It was massive, fit for a monarch, with carved posts, velvet drapes and layers of blankets. But underneath all that splendour, the mattress was most likely stuffed with straw or wool, possibly feathers, depending on the season. These materials were breathable, sure, but they also absorbed everything. Body oils, sweat, perfume, lice, smoke, and occasionally urine, if we're being brutally honest. Linen sheets were changed more often than outer garments, but not daily. Maybe once a week, if Elizabeth was feeling generous. And that meant every night she nestled into a sleep space that was essentially a history book of her own bodily functions. A particularly grim historical fact? In the colder months, warmth took priority over hygiene. The bed curtains would be drawn shut to trap heat, creating a cosy cocoon of recycled air. The Queen would sleep wearing several layers, possibly including gloves and a nightcap, and may have had a warming pan, a metal container filled with hot coals slid between her sheets to cut through the chill. Sounds luxurious, but add the scent of scorched linen and smoky coals to an already stagnant room, and you're not exactly drifting off to sleep in a lavender field. And it wasn't just the bed. The floor of her chamber was likely covered in rushes or carpets that weren't cleaned regularly. These were sprinkled with herbs and dried flowers in a constant futile effort to battle the underlying odours of foot traffic, food spills, chamber pot dribbles and muddy boots. Over time, that once fresh layer turned into a mat of rotting plant matter and ground in grime, like a compost pile, but with better embroidery. Here's where things get even more weirder. Elizabeth sometimes held audiences in her bedchamber. That's right. Foreign ambassadors, nobles, and key advisors would be granted access to this most intimate space to deliver reports or present gifts. It was meant to be a sign of favour, a rare exclusive glimpse behind the veil. But what they really got was a close-up encounter with the royal sensory reality. They sat on velvet stools, fanned themselves against the heat, and tried not to gag on the heady blend of musk, herbs, candle smoke, and centuries of barely clean textiles. There's an open, scholarly debate about whether Elizabeth herself was noseblind to all of this. Some suggest she was so accustomed to the smell that she no longer noticed it. Others argue that she was aware and obsessively tried to combat it, changing linens more frequently than most monarchs, insisting on sachets in every fold of her drapes, and dousing herself in perfume before bed. There are even records of her sleeping with perfumed gloves on, supposedly to soothe her with scent or ward off imagined airborne illness. So while she couldn't eliminate the smell, she could at least out-fragrance it. But the thing is, none of this was unusual. Every royal bedchamber across Europe had the same issues. People didn't bathe regularly. They wore layers to bed. They sweated through those layers. They ate in their rooms. They relieved themselves in pots hidden behind curtains. It was just life. The difference was, Elizabeth had to maintain the illusion of divine cleanliness within that chaos. Her bedroom was supposed to be a sanctuary, an extension of her power. So the ladies scrubbed at stains with lemon peel and vinegar. They hung sachets of crushed mint. They powdered the floorboards. And every night the Queen slipped into bed hoping it was enough to maintain the spell. One fringe fact? There's evidence that Elizabeth occasionally had musicians play softly outside her bedchamber at night, not just for ambience, but to distract from the creaks and groans of the old palace, or perhaps to cover up the less glamorous sounds of digestion, snoring, or chamber pots being carried out. A little Tudor white noise, if you will. In the end, Elizabeth's bedchamber was a perfect metaphor for her reign. Grand on the surface, carefully maintained, layered in tradition and symbolism, but underneath, a stew of human complications barely held at bay. She slept surrounded by her own legend, breathing in the very fabric of it, and hoping, praying it didn't unravel. So the next time you lie back on clean sheets in an air-conditioned room, light a candle and stretch out with a fan humming nearby, remember this. Elizabeth of Phersey ruled a kingdom from a room that smelled like unwashed velvet, beeswax, and ambition. And somehow she still made it work. At this point you've gotten a full head-to-toe immersion in Queen Elizabeth of Phersey's hygiene, or more accurately the lack of it. But we're not done yet. Tonight we're zeroing in on something that may sound like a minor detail, but actually reveals a whole world of strange daily ritual. How the Queen cleaned herself without water. You'd think there'd be a basin involved, maybe some soap and a splash or two, but no, Elizabeth, like most people in her time, subscribed to a form of hygiene that looked more like medieval dry cleaning than anything we'd recognise today. Spoiler, the knives come out. In Elizabeth's court, washing wasn't about water. In fact, many people were deeply suspicious of water touching their skin. It was thought to be dangerous, even deadly. The prevailing theory was that water opened the pores and allowed disease to enter the body. So rather than scrubbing themselves in a bath, people turned to something called dry washing, and the Queen was no exception. Every morning, instead of stepping into a washroom, Elizabeth was seated in her chamber, and her ladies-in-waiting would begin the ritual. They'd take pieces of fine linen cloth, sometimes lightly dampened with rosewater or vinegar, and rub her skin briskly. The idea was to remove the outer layer of dirt, oils, and dead skin by friction alone. If something was particularly stubborn, like a stain or an oily patch, they might scrape it off with a small blunt knife, gently dragging it along her arms or neck. That's right. She literally had grime scraped off her skin, and let's be real, even with a soft cloth and the best intentions, that's not exactly the spa experience. The knife wasn't sharp, but it didn't need to be. It was about exfoliation, centuries before anyone invented that term. The Queen's skin was rubbed, brushed, patted, and scraped until it was clean enough to pass courtly inspection. And afterward, powders were applied. Lots of them. The goal wasn't to feel fresh, it was to look clean. Her attendants dusted her with finely ground starch or talc mixed with crushed herbs, often lavender or rosemary. This didn't clean anything, of course. It just made her smell slightly better and feel less greasy. Imagine dusting your armpits with floral flour and calling it a shower. Now here's the really wild part. Elizabeth's dry washing routine was considered cutting edge. It showed refinement, restraint, a noble sense of balance between the body and the spirit. The common folk might dunk themselves in rivers, but royalty? They maintained control. This idea that visible cleanliness equaled moral superiority was deeply ingrained. And so, while the Queen was being dabbed and dusted in her chamber, no one ever asked if she felt clean. That wasn't the point. She had to appear pure, ethereal, untouchable. But let's zoom in for a second. If you're scraping your skin daily and layering powders over it, what happens? Irritation, micro-tears, inflammation. And Elizabeth's skin was already compromised thanks to years of wearing lead-based makeup. So while she may have looked flawless from across the throne room up close, her skin was likely patchy, raw and uneven. Historians have speculated that the layers of powder and rouge weren't just cosmetic, they were medicinal. A soothing cover for inflamed, peeling skin. Basically makeup as band-aid. And what about the smell? That too was managed more than eradicated. Her underarms, feet and hairline were treated with perfumed cloths, but without soap or running water, body odour always returned. The Queen's scent was a careful layering of fragrance over funk, like a particularly fancy onion. There's a fringe detail I can't leave out. Elizabeth reportedly used a special blend of herbs rubbed directly onto her skin during periods of illness or stress. This mix included sage, marjoram and bay leaf, often steeped in wine and left to evaporate into the cloth before use. It was believed to ward off infection, soothe the spirit and mask signs of fatigue. So in essence, the Queen was using what we might call herbal body wipes, except they smelled like a roast chicken and didn't do much for hygiene. And while all this was happening, her ladies-in-waiting were under immense pressure. Touching the Queen's body was an act of deep trust, but also risk. If you scrubbed too hard, if you caused discomfort, if you overstepped in any way, you could be dismissed. One wrong move, and your career was over. So the Queen's daily cleaning became not just a chore, but a test of loyalty, patience, and social skill. Smile, dab, powder, step back, repeat. Now, some scholars argue that Elizabeth was more hygienic than records suggest, that she may have bathed in private more often than she let on, especially when plagued with ailments like tooth infections or rashes. But the public record, the rituals of the court and the testimonies of foreign ambassadors all point to a woman who embraced this cloth and scrape method as her primary hygiene routine. It matched her worldview, cautious, symbolic, controlled, and really this strange dry routine tells us so much about her as a ruler. She didn't just manage her body, she curated it. Every inch of her appearance was a performance, a political maneuver. Even how she removed dirt was steeped in symbolism. She didn't soak it away like a carefree peasant. She had it peeled like fruit by servants, with linen soaked in herbs. So picture her now, seated upright in her chamber, the curtains drawn, her expression calm but wary. A maid gently rubbing her forearm with a lavender cloth, another kneeling by her feet, scraping gently at her heels, powder drifting through the candlelight. The Queen still and powerful, being erased and rebuilt at the same time. And maybe that's the most haunting part of it all. The cleaning didn't actually clean, it just maintained the illusion that her body was something more than mortal, something divine, and everyone in the room had to pretend it worked. So the next time you stand in a hot shower and let water run down your face, remember, Queen Elizabeth sitting perfectly still as dead skin is scraped from her forearms with a dull knife, and powder is patted into the creases of her elbows, because that, in her world, was as close as anyone got to clean. At this point, you're probably screaming into the void, why didn't anyone just take a proper bath? Fair question. And tonight, we're finally getting to the root of that mystery. Because if Elizabeth Fartway avoided bathing like it was a cursed potion, it wasn't just superstition or vanity. It was, real, historical, bone-deep fear of water. Not because it was cold or inconvenient, but because people truly believed it could kill you. So let's dig into the Tudor terror of water, the paradox of filth and disease, and why stepping into a bath was sometimes viewed as a flirtation with death. In the 16th century, water didn't equal cleanliness. In fact, for most of Elizabeth's life, water equaled danger. Doctors and philosophers of the time, influenced by the ancient idea of humours, the 4 bodily fluids that supposedly governed health, believed the skin was a porous membrane. If you opened your pores, you risked letting disease seep into the body like fog into a window crack. And you know what opened pores? Warm water, steam, scrubbing. So when the Queen sat down for a rare sponge bath, she wasn't just pampering herself, she was, in the eyes of her own physicians, taking a calculated risk. And the water itself. It wasn't exactly sparkling Evian. Even the royal water supply was dodgy. London's rivers were filled with waste, human, animal, and industrial. Water was pulled from the Thames and other local streams, often upstream of butchers, tanners, and people dumping chamber pots. Filtration as we know it didn't exist. The idea that you could get sick from dirty water wasn't quite formed yet. Instead, people thought sickness was in the air that clung to water, especially warm water. In other words, the bath wasn't just a luxury. It was a suspected delivery system for the plague. Which leads us to one truly unsettling historical fact. During plague outbreaks, public bathhouses were shut down entirely, not to prevent crowding, but because it was believed that bathing made people more vulnerable. Opening your pores could let in the foul miasma, the bad air that carried disease. And once that air got inside you, game over. Better to stay sealed up in your own crust, covered in layers of protective filth, than to risk inviting in something worse. Elizabeth, naturally, took these warnings seriously. Her physicians were not modern doctors. They were essentially astrologer, herbalists, spiritual advisors with very little actual science behind their prescriptions, and they regularly advised her against full-body immersion. They preferred controlled steamings with cloths soaked in herbs or light vinegar rub-downs. A bath might be permitted when she was feeling especially out of balance, but even then it was followed by powdering, swaddling in dry linens, and prayers. That's right, bathing was a medical event, practically a religious rite. No candles and whale songs here, just a chorus of grimacing servants and paranoid herbalists muttering about your liver. But here's the truly ironic twist. Despite all their efforts to avoid disease, the lack of bathing probably made things worse. Skin infections, lice, sores, even outbreaks of syphilis and scabies were more common among the noble classes precisely because they refused to cleanse their skin regularly. Dead skin built up, infected cuts festered, and yet the belief remained that it was the act of bathing, not the lack of it, that caused these problems. It's the historical version of blaming a fire extinguisher for the kitchen blaze. And it didn't help that bathing was also considered morally suspect. Public bathhouses, even the respectable ones, had a reputation for encouraging scandalous behaviour. There were rumours, some true, some not, that people used them as meeting places for secret affairs, so a clean body became associated, in some circles, with a dirty conscience. Elizabeth, obsessed with projecting purity and control, avoided anything that could remotely taint her image. Her body wasn't just hers, it was the state's, and the state couldn't be seen frolicking in a tub. Even the architecture of her palaces tells the story. While some royal residences had bath chambers or stews, they were often tucked away, infrequently used, and more symbolic than practical. Elizabeth did have a bath at Richmond Palace, described as a large stone basin set into a tiled floor. But records suggest it was used sparingly and more often aired than filled. The Queen might have sat in it a handful of times per year, perhaps after illness, or before major state events, but certainly not on the regular. For a woman with access to every comfort of the age, she still lived in a state of near-constant perfumed filth. There's a quirky little fringe detail that somehow makes all this even worse. Elizabeth reportedly had special cloths infused with purifying powders delivered from Italy. These were luxury items, fine linen soaked in a mixture of crushed pearls, saffron, rose petals, and camphor. They were designed to be dabbed gently over the body to ward off sickness and refresh the humours. And, of course, they cost a small fortune. The Tudor version of a $300 face wipe only it smelled like someone spilled soup in a flower shop. See? So what did all this mean for daily life? It meant that the Queen, her courtiers, and her entire world existed in a state of fragile, fragrant denial. They feared disease but misdiagnosed its cause. They craved beauty but destroyed their skin to achieve it. And in place of actual hygiene, they created rituals. Elaborate, symbolic acts that did little to clean and everything to appear clean. It was all about the illusion, a daily performance of purity, while the truth festered just beneath the surface. Still, Elizabeth made it work. Somehow. She reigned for over 40 years through war, plague, rebellion and scandal. All without taking regular baths, all without soap, all without clean water. And when she walked into a room, powdered, perfumed and glowing in candlelight, no one questioned it. Because the illusion was stronger than the smell. So the next time you step into a hot shower, turn the knob and let clean water cascade over your skin, pause for a moment. Think of the Queen, hunched on a stool, wiping herself with a camphor-soaked rag, flinching as her physician warns her not to get wet. Think of the fear, the confusion, the absolute conviction that cleanliness could kill you. And then be grateful for plumbing and science and the sweet, sweet joy of washing your hair whenever you want. You've heard the rumours about Elizabeth's terrible teeth, her scented gloves, the Great War against lice, and the tragedy of her never-washed wardrobe. But now it's time to focus on one of her most loyal and tragically useless companions, the toothpick. Yes, the humble, seemingly harmless little toothpick. Because in a world without floss, mouthwash, or actual toothpaste, that tiny sliver of wood, or in Elizabeth's case, ivory or gold, was all that stood between royal dignity and dental disaster. And spoiler, it didn't stand a chance. Elizabeth of Fructose was known to obsess over her appearance, and that included her mouth, even as her teeth slowly blackened and crumbled. As we've already covered, she loved sweets. Sugared violets, candied fruits, and marzipan so rich it could probably coat a brick. But sugar combined with non-existent dental hygiene meant that by the time she was middle-aged, her teeth were decayed, aching and likely reeking, and so the toothpick became her last, best hope for saving face, quite literally. These weren't the splintery, sad toothpicks you find in diner napkin dispensers. Elizabeth's were works of art, carved from silver, gold and ivory, often set with tiny gemstones. She carried them in decorative cases, which could be worn around the neck or tucked into a sleeve. It was less about dental hygiene and more about fashion, like a Tudor-era flex. Look at me, I'm so rich, I have a tool just for my molars. But make no mistake, she used them often, and not just for show. Imagine the Queen at her writing desk, furrowed over a letter to a foreign ambassador, and then, mid-thought, pulling out a jewelled toothpick to gingerly pry a chunk of sticky fig from her back teeth. It sounds small, even elegant, until you realise she was doing this multiple times a day, not because it worked, but because it was the only option. Brushing as we know, it didn't exist. Tooth powders were available, made from crushed eggshells, burnt bread or even powdered brick, but they were abrasive and inconsistent. And the Queen's teeth were already fragile. So she stuck to poking. There's even a peculiar etiquette that developed around toothpicks in Elizabeth's court. After meals, it was considered fashionable to use one publicly, often while seated or standing casually near the fire. Think of it like a social grace, proof that you cared about your appearance. But instead of freshening your breath, it probably just redistributed the rot. In Elizabeth's case, there's some evidence that she used scented toothpicks, dipped in herbal oils like clove or mint, in an attempt to fight the smell. Not exactly Listerine, but it was something. And let's talk about that smell for a moment. Scholars and ambassadors who met Elizabeth in her later years often noted her offensive breath, despite her efforts to mask it. Clove oil was the favourite weapon, dabbed onto cloths, gloves, and yes, her beloved toothpicks. Clove has natural numbing properties and antimicrobial effects, so it actually helped with tooth pain. But again, it wasn't enough. The toothpick didn't stop decay, it just moved the battle around the battlefield. One strange fact, Elizabeth occasionally gifted ornate toothpick cases to members of her court as a sign of favour. These were handcrafted, beautifully engraved and deeply personal. A gift from the Queen's own dental survival kit. Imagine receiving a golden toothpick from a monarch whose smile could clear a room. What exactly is the message there? I like you enough to help you not smell like me. Either way, it was an honour. There's an open scholarly debate about just how effective these early dental tools were. Some argue that regular use of toothpicks could have prevented at least some build-up of food and plaque. Others suggest they may have caused more damage than they prevented, especially in Elizabeth's fragile mouth. Repeated prodding of infected gums and decaying teeth could spread bacteria and accelerate rot. And yet she kept using them, because they were what she had. Because in a strange way they gave her a sense of control over something that was clearly spiralling. And when the pain flared, which it often did, she'd sometimes retreat from court appearances, blaming a cold or fatigue. Her physicians, the chef horse, had no good solutions. They prescribed mouth rinses made of vinegar, honey and herbs. Occasionally wine or even mercury was recommended, depending on how much the doctor liked to live dangerously. But in the end, the Queen often refused invasive treatment. She was famously needle-averse and terrified of showing physical vulnerability. So the toothache became just one more thing she had to rule through, gritting what remained of her teeth, poking and prodding, and carrying on. One particularly grim moment comes from 1592, when a diplomatic visit from a French envoy was nearly cancelled because Elizabeth's toothache was so severe she couldn't speak. Her advisors panicked. Cancelling such a meeting was politically risky, so what did they do? They bribed a bishop to undergo a public tooth extraction, just to show the Queen it wouldn't be so bad. He had a healthy tooth yanked out in front of her, like a bloody TED talk on pain management. It worked. Kind of. Elizabeth finally agreed to have the rotten tooth pulled, but it was a rare concession, and one she never repeated lightly. Toothbrushes, as we know them, wouldn't appear in Europe until decades later. And even then they were primitive, bristled sticks soaked in salt or vinegar. Elizabeth's reign existed in the awkward dental limbo between ancient twigs and modern dental care. And so the toothpick reigned supreme. It was jewellery, it was ritual, it was desperate. And it did almost nothing. So next time you floss, yes, floss, don't lie, take a moment to appreciate what you've got. The minty swish of mouthwash, the fluoride in your toothpaste, the fact that your teeth, hopefully, don't need to be scraped with gold wire in the middle of a council meeting. Because Queen Elizabeth I, for all her wisdom and power, was still just a woman in pearls, wincing as she jabbed a clove-scented splinter between teeth that were already halfway to the grave. Let's lean in a little closer, if you dare, and talk about the time Queen Elizabeth's mouth nearly brought her reign to its knees. Yes, her mouth. Not a scandalous word or political blunder, but a toothache so violent, so paralysing that it briefly threatened to derail the most powerful woman in Europe. This wasn't just a case of sore gums and mumbled speeches. This was royal agony, bubbling just beneath a powdered, painted mask. And when that pain finally reached its breaking point, it revealed just how fragile Elizabeth's carefully crafted image really was. We've already established the basics. Elizabeth's teeth were a slow-motion disaster. By the time she reached her late 50s, decay had eaten away at much of her dental health. Her breath, according to more than one court visitor, was foul, and her smile, when it appeared at all, was tight-lipped, guarded, and strategically shadowed by handkerchiefs or fans. But behind the scenes, something much worse was brewing. An abscess, a festering infected pocket deep in her jaw that left her sleepless, speechless, and furious with pain. Historical accounts point to the winter of 1592 as the boiling point. Elizabeth was in her late 50s, still dazzling in public, still sharp and politically astute. But behind closed doors, she was suffering. Courtiers noted her irritability, her sudden absences from council meetings, her shortened audiences. At first, they assumed fatigue or one of her notorious melancholy fits. But soon, the truth emerged. Her face was swollen, her jaw stiff, and she couldn't eat without flinching. The Queen had a toothache, and it wasn't going away. In an era without antibiotics, anaesthetics, or any real understanding of infection, dental issues were life-threatening. An untreated abscess could rupture, spread to the bloodstream, and cause a swift, agonizing death. Elizabeth knew this, everyone knew this. But she was stubborn. She refused examination, she turned away her physicians. When they suggested removing the tooth, she balked. The idea of enduring that kind of pain, or worse, showing that pain, was unthinkable. Her body was not just private, it was symbolic. Letting it fail in public felt like letting the nation down. So what did her advisors do? They staged a performance, and this part would be funny if it weren't so bleak. They brought in a bishop, a trusted court figure, and had him undergo a tooth extraction right in front of her. Not because he needed it, but because they hoped the Queen would see that it wasn't that bad. So there he sat, jaw clenched, hands gripping the chair, while a barber surgeon wrenched a perfectly healthy tooth from his mouth, all for the sake of royal persuasion. It worked. Kind of. Elizabeth finally relented. According to one account, she had the offending tooth pulled, but only after ensuring it was done in complete privacy, with no witnesses save for her closest attendants. The instruments were likely crude: forceps, a hook, maybe a knife to loosen the gum. The process would have been brutal, quick, and blood-soaked. There was no numbing, no sedation, just a rush of pain and the thick metallic taste of her own blood. But afterward, the swelling eased, the pain faded, and the Queen returned to court, silent about the ordeal, but visibly exhausted. There's a fringe rumour that she kept the tooth afterward, stored in a box or wrapped in cloth as a memento of her endurance. While there's no solid evidence for this, it wouldn't be out of character. Elizabeth collected symbols of power and resilience like trophies, and what better reminder of her ability to suffer in sin than a blackened piece of her own jaw? But the pain didn't just affect her physically, it had political consequences. In the weeks before the extraction, foreign ambassadors reported delays in negotiations. Courtiers struggled to gain audiences. Even her letters became shorter, more curt. It was as if the tooth had infected not just her mouth, but her entire administration. And for a monarch so obsessed with control, that must have been terrifying. Scholars debate how often this kind of thing happened. Was this a one-time crisis? Or were there smaller, hidden episodes throughout her reign? Moments of pain hidden behind the ruff, behind the fan, behind the crown? Some believe Elizabeth suffered from chronic dental infections in her later years, each one eroding her patience and possibly even affecting her decision-making. Others argue that this particular toothache was unique, an embarrassing, vulnerable moment she refused to repeat. What's certain is that after the 1592 incident, her public appearances became even more tightly controlled. She smiled less. She avoided long speeches. Her portrait painters, already under strict instruction to idealise her, began to depict her in more symbolic forms, her face painted like a mask, her expression serene and unreadable. The real woman, with her jaw still tender and her breath sharp with clove oil, was increasingly hidden behind art and distance. And yet she endured. She always endured. That was the magic trick. Elizabeth wasn't just the Virgin Queen, she was the invulnerable Queen. The one who outlived threats, rebellions, suitors and sickness. The one who bled in secret, who suffered in silence, who ruled with a rotting tooth and dared anyone to question her strength. It's a strange kind of heroism, really. We're used to thinking of courage in terms of battles or speeches, but there's something deeply human and oddly moving about the idea of a woman who refused to let a tooth defeat her, who bit down, quite literally, and carried on. And when the tooth finally gave out, she pulled it, healed, and returned it to her throne like nothing happened. That's not just power, that's survival. So next time you feel that dull ache in your molar and reach for the phone to schedule a dentist appointment, pause for a moment. Think of Elizabeth, reclining in her private chamber, pale with pain, jaw clenched, fan fluttering, while a bishop next door yells through clenched teeth. Think of her refusing help, refusing fear, until the moment she couldn't refuse anymore. Because sometimes, even queens have to bite the pain before it bites them. If you've stuck with me this far, through the lice, the lead makeup, the dental horrors, and the perfumed bodily illusions, brace yourself. Because now we're stepping into a topic even more shrouded in royal silence than any chamber pot or toothache. Menstruation. That's right. The Virgin Queen bled. Not forever, of course, but for decades of her life, just like every other woman. And yet, if you comb through the letters, journals and official accounts of her reign, you'll find barely a whisper of it. The reality of Elizabeth I's periods was one of the best-kept secrets of her royal body, and the ways she likely dealt with it, quietly, strategically, and uncomfortably, paint a revealing picture of just how far she had to go to maintain her mythical image. Let's begin with the obvious. Elizabeth's body was never just her own. From the moment she became queen in 1558, it became a national object of fascination. Speculation and control. Was she truly a virgin? Was she fertile? Could she still bear children? Ambassadors wrote home about her skin tone and whether she looked in season. Her womb was a source of political anxiety, but her menstrual cycle, that was too vulgar to mention. And yet it happened, month after month, painfully, messily, and in the heart of a court built on illusion. So how did she handle it? Let's talk technology, or the lack of it. In Elizabeth's time, there were no pads, no tampons, no menstrual cups, nothing with adhesive, nothing disposable. What women used instead were cloth rags, sometimes called clouts, folded and tucked into position with belts or ties. These were reused, washed, though not always thoroughly, and dried near the fire. It's likely Elizabeth used versions made from soft linen, custom-stitched by her ladies and scented with herbs to mask the smell. But even the best rag can only do so much when you're wearing 15 pounds of embroidered silk and sitting on a throne for hours at a time. You can almost picture the scene. Elizabeth, mid-audience, seated in her vast court robes, a tightly boned corset pressing into her abdomen, trying not to shift too much in her seat as cramps twist beneath the layers. There are no hot water bottles, no midol, just herbal tonics, some effective, most not, and the willpower of a monarch trained from birth to never flinch. And God help the lady-in-waiting who misjudged the Queen's mood on those days. It was understood, even if never spoken aloud. There were times when Her Majesty was sharper, less patient, and her closest attendants likely adjusted their behaviour accordingly. Historical accounts remain silent on the subject, of course. Royal records didn't include the Queen had cramps today or postponed because of heavy bleeding. But the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Women's physical realities were so deeply suppressed in the Tudor period that any mention of them, even in private letters, was rare. Still, some court whispers survive. References to the Queen being unwell, retiring for rest, or prone to humoral imbalance. All polite euphemisms for the messy business happening under those stiff petticoats. There's even debate among scholars about when Elizabeth entered menopause. Given that she was born in 1533, she likely experienced the transition sometime in the mid to late 1580s, when she was in her early 50s. That means she spent nearly 30 years of her reign menstruating, 30 years of managing royal processions, war councils, and diplomatic negotiations with a body that bled unpredictably. And she did it all without breaking the illusion of immortal, untouchable perfection. Let's not forget, menstruation in Elizabeth's time wasn't just taboo, it was considered dangerous. Blood was viewed through the lens of humoral theory, which claimed that the human body was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Menstrual blood, they believed, was toxic waste that needed to be expelled. If it didn't come out properly, it was thought to cause madness, hysteria, or even possession. And if it did come out, it made a woman unclean spiritually and physically. The Queen, therefore, had to hide it completely. There could be no hint of leaking, no visible stain, no accidental odour. Her sheets, gowns, and cushions were carefully monitored. Her servants probably washed her menstrual cloths in guarded privacy, and the Queen herself never ever spoke of it. In public, she remained the Virgin Queen, pure, ethereal, bloodless. But behind the drapes, there was linen soaked in rosewater, crumpled rags laid out to dry by the fire, and the quiet reality of a woman enduring the monthly cost of being female. One fascinating fringe fact: some 16th century texts suggest women could halt their periods through rigorous fasting or use of certain herbs. While these claims were often exaggerated, it's possible Elizabeth experimented with herbal regimens to reduce her flow or shorten the duration. She was famously careful about what she ate and drank, perhaps not just for appearance, but as a subtle form of bodily control, and control was everything. To lose control of your body, even briefly, was to invite whispers, doubts, rumours. The Queen could not afford to be seen as weak, irrational, or worst of all, womanly in the eyes of her male-dominated court. So she bled in silence. And when the bleeding finally stopped in her 50s, it was another secret milestone passed without fanfare. Yet, menopause brought its own challenges. Hot flashes in full court dress, night sweats under heavy blankets, mood swings while trying to balance Protestant diplomacy and Spanish threats. Absolutely, but still the Queen kept her composure. She masked it with powder, perfume, and her famously sharp tongue. If anyone noticed changes in her behaviour, they chalked it up to ageing or stress. No one dared suggest the Queen's body was shifting under her silks. And maybe that's the most remarkable part. Elizabeth ruled for over 40 years with a body that bled, ached, bloated and burned. She endured it all without ever being allowed to admit it. Her femininity was constantly weaponized against her, used to question her fitness to rule, to pressure her into marriage, to undermine her authority. So she built an image of divine control, a woman untouched by the biological chaos everyone else endured. But inside that image, a human being quietly wringing out a cloth in a basin of rose-scented water. So the next time you grumble about cramps on a workday or debate whether to wear white pants on day 2, remember Queen Elizabeth, sitting on a throne with a uterus staging a full-scale revolt beneath her corset. Smiling politely through bloating, clenching her jaw through backaches, issuing royal decrees while soaked linen waited in her bedchamber. She was powerful, she was mythic, and yes, she absolutely had her period. By now, you know that Queen Elizabeth I was wrapped in more layers than a gift inside another gift. And those layers weren't just about fashion or modesty, they were odour armour. Every inch of fabric between her body and the world served as the scented buffer zone. And nowhere was this more obvious than her hands. You see, her hands were always on display, gesturing during court audiences, grasping letters, extending toward foreign dignitaries. They had to appear immaculate, even if they weren't exactly clean. And that's where perfumed gloves came in. Stylish, symbolic, and frankly, hiding a whole lot more than just a dry cuticle or two. Elizabeth was famously fond of gloves. In fact, they were one of her signature accessories, often made of kid leather, intricately embroidered with gold thread and encrusted with pearls or tiny jewels. But the real magic was in the scent. These gloves weren't just fashion statements, they were walking air fresheners. They were soaked, rubbed, and even baked with exotic perfumes. Rose oil, jasmine, clove, civet, musk, and occasionally ambergris, which is a fancy term for whale vomit and somehow one of the most coveted perfume ingredients of the day. Don't think about it too hard. Now, the reason she wore perfume gloves wasn't purely to smell nice. These gloves served a very specific and very necessary purpose, to disguise the smell of her hands, because Elizabeth didn't wash her hands the way we do. Soap was used rarely, and mostly for laundry or dishes. For skin, the routine was more about dabbing with vinegar-soaked cloths, and if you were lucky, wiping off grime with a spritz of rosewater. So even the Queen, attended by the finest ladies in the realm, went through most days with hands that were, let's be honest, not fresh. Consider her daily life, touching scrolls sealed with wax, holding letters delivered by men who'd been riding for days, eating with her fingers, as utensils were still considered optional for many meals, and pressing her palms against whatever furniture had soaked up years of smoke and sweat. And when she wasn't doing that, she was shaking hands with courtiers, handling gloves other people had kissed, or gripping the arms of her velvet-upholstered throne. The result? A sensory experience best described as tangy parchment with notes of leather and underlying dread. So the gloves did the heavy lifting. Each morning before greeting her court, she would select a pair from her collection. Soft, pliable, lined with silk and pre-scented. Sometimes the scent was applied in oil form, rubbed directly into the leather. Other times, gloves were stored in wooden boxes filled with herbs so the leather absorbed the fragrance overnight. Think of it like a cedar chest meets Sephora. The goal was to have her hands emit a cloud of floral mystery the moment they moved through the air. And it wasn't just about scent. The gloves also served a symbolic function. In diplomatic settings, offering or accepting gloves was a powerful gesture. Elizabeth famously gifted perfumed gloves to visiting dignitaries, always ornate, always heavily scented, as a symbol of personal favour. But let's be honest, she was probably also giving them a head start on surviving the Tudor stink. Here, Your Grace, for our alliance, and also your nose. There's a strange little fact buried in one of her inventories. Some gloves were even lined with powdered herbs meant to purify the humours through skin absorption, because as we've covered, bad smells were considered both a symptom and a cause of illness. So Elizabeth didn't just want to smell good, she wanted her gloves to act like a second skin that could ward off disease. She was essentially wearing mobile potpourri gloves as both a fashion choice and a desperate attempt at self-defence. But here's the problem. No matter how lovely the gloves were, they were still being worn on unwashed hands. Hands that sweated, hands that touched everything from quills to chamber pots, hands that by the end of the day probably felt sticky, swollen, and overwhelmed. Leather is a natural material, it breathes, but it also traps. which means the gloves didn't just mask odours, they marinated in them. If you've ever worn gloves on a hot day and then peeled them off to find your palms damp and slightly funky, you've gotten a small, luxurious glimpse into Elizabeth's daily discomfort. And yet, like everything else in her life, the gloves were a performance, a layer between the world and her body, a signal of refinement and distance. When she extended her hand, gloved, scented, glowing in candlelight, it told people everything they needed to believe, that she was divine, that she was above decay, that she was untouchable. There's a scholarly debate over how often she changed her gloves throughout the day. Some suggest she rotated pairs during long ceremonies, swapping out worn ones for fresher scents. Others think she wore a single pair per day, relying on the strength of the fragrance to carry her through. What's certain is that her glove collection was immense, dozens, maybe hundreds of pairs, all stored with care and scented religiously. One of the strangest things, you can still find some of those gloves in museums today. Preserved over centuries, some retain faint traces of their original perfume, a ghost of lavender or musk lingering in the seams. Imagine that, the faint smell of Elizabeth Vier's hands, trapped in leather, still whispering through time. It's both eerie and oddly intimate. A queen who never touched the common world, now forever remembered through the scent she left behind. And maybe that's the real story here. Elizabeth's perfumed gloves weren't just about covering up unwashed hands. They were part of a larger system of boundaries, physical, sensory, symbolic. The gloves weren't just to protect others from her. They were to protect her from others, from disease, from judgment, from being too real, because once the illusion cracked, once you saw the woman beneath the glove, tired, sweaty, mortal, it was all over. So next time you slide on a pair of winter gloves and catch the faint smell of last year's hand lotion, think of Elizabeth. Think of her sitting on her throne, palm outstretched, wearing 3 rings over a glove soaked in civet musk, with a hand that hadn't seen soap in a month, and think about the sheer power of scent to carry an entire monarchy. By now, you might be asking yourself, how did Elizabeth I not die from all of this? The lead paint, the rotten teeth, the lice, the infrequent bathing. How did she survive into her 70s when half of her subjects dropped dead before 35? The answer, weirdly enough, lies partly in the truly bizarre medical treatments she endured. Because while she may not have washed regularly or brushed her teeth, Elizabeth was still a firm believer in the healing power of medicine, or at least what counted as medicine in the 16th century. And tonight, we're diving into the world of Tudor cures, where frogs, cow dung and powdered skulls were all on the menu, and smelling bad was considered a vital part of getting better. Let's start with the frogs. Yes, frogs. Specifically boiled frogs, which were often used in poultices meant to treat swelling, skin conditions, or bizarrely melancholy. The idea was that the heat and moist nature of the frog counteracted whatever imbalance was assumed to be causing the ailment. If Elizabeth came down with a rash, or even just a touch of sadness, a warm, fragrant packet of amphibian goo might be applied to her skin. And no, they didn't remove the bones or the smell. This wasn't science. This was medieval optimism with a sprinkle of superstition. And frogs were just the start. And Tudor medicine was based almost entirely on the theory of the 4 humours: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Health meant balance, illness meant imbalance. So if Elizabeth had a fever, it wasn't a virus, it was too much heat. If she had a chill, she had too much cold. And the solutions? They ranged from gently questionable to outright horrifying. Bloodletting was a go-to treatment, even for mild issues. Feeling faint? Let's cut open a vein and rebalance you. Overindulged in sweets? Let's purge you with a herbal enema and a prayer. Elizabeth's personal physicians were highly educated by the standards of their day, and she had several over the course of her reign. But even they subscribed to treatments that now sound like medieval witchcraft. They recommended mercury vapour for skin infections, arsenic for complexion problems, and poultices made of cow dung and butter to reduce inflammation. That's right, literal manure rubbed into the royal skin. With the best of intentions, and while she was cautious by nature, frequently refusing invasive procedures, Elizabeth still submitted to these rituals. Not because she believed in everyone necessarily, but because she understood the performance of medicine. Just like her clothes, her speech, and her image, healing was something she had to perform. If the queen looked unwell, the kingdom felt unwell. So when she took to her bed with a mysterious fever, the entire court held its breath. And when she emerged, powdered and silent, with a nosegay pressed to her face and a freshly boiled frog on her nightstand, presumably retired from service, It was a sign of resilience. One real historical detail: Elizabeth reportedly used a salve made from white lead and vinegar to treat skin eruptions, which, yes, only made her condition worse. She likely didn't know it was killing her. Or maybe she suspected, but the alternative was showing her blemished, aging skin to a court that expected her to look divine. Her physicians also prescribed tonics laced with gold flakes, believing that precious metals contained healing properties. So essentially, the Queen was microdosing royal currency and poison at the same time. And then there were the smells. Oh, the smells. A significant part of Elizabeth's medical routine involved inhaling things, herbs, powders, fumes, designed to either calm the spirit or drive out illness. Bad smells were considered dangerous, good smells were medicinal. Sage, rosemary, lavender, camphor and myrrh were all part of her wellness arsenal. Physicians even created custom scent blends to protect her from plague, which they believed travelled through corrupted air. Elizabeth carried pomanders, small metal balls filled with herbs and spices that she held near her face, especially during the outbreaks. And when illness struck the palace, rooms were fumigated with burnt resin and herbs until the air was thick with the smoke of desperation. There's one odd little fringe fact that pops up in court records. Elizabeth once used a treatment involving powdered mummy, yes, actual ground-up remains of Egyptian mummies, mixed into a tonic for vitality. This was shockingly common among the elite in Europe, who believed that ingesting preserved bodies gave them strength, wisdom, or healing power. Mummia, as it was called, was imported. Expensive and often fake, but that didn't stop anyone, including, it seems, the Queen of England. So where did all of this leave her? In a constant tug of war between dignity and discomfort. When she fell ill, she had to hide it. When she was treated, she had to pretend it worked. Even her physicians, who surely suspected their remedies were more ritual than cure, played along, because Elizabeth's body wasn't just private, it was political. If she collapsed, so did the illusion of an eternal, unshakable monarchy. And yet somehow she lived into her 70s, despite, or perhaps because of, this strange mix of superstition and discipline. She avoided excessive feasting. She drank modestly. She distrusted surgery and rarely allowed bloodletting unless it was unavoidable. And while she dabbled in boiled frogs and powdered skulls, she also took long walks in her gardens, slept in well-ventilated chambers, and kept a tight, vigilant circle of attendants. Was it enough to offset the makeup and the mouth infections? Probably not, but it kept her just healthy enough to rule. So the next time you pop an ibuprofen or slap on a band-aid, be thankful. You're not inhaling powdered resin, while a doctor waves a burning cloth of wormwood over your head. You're not rubbing cow dung into a rash while sipping crushed pharaohs for energy. You're not treating a cough with raw onion jam and boiled snails. But Queen Elizabeth was. Because that was what the body meant in Tudor medicine. A battlefield of scents, rituals, and increasingly desperate faith. And through it all she held the line, still powdered, still poised, and still pretending none of it smelled as bad as it did. At this point, your respect for Elizabeth I might be wobbling somewhere between admiration and horrified sympathy. But if you thought her personal hygiene routine was tough, just wait until you step into the olfactory nightmare that was her royal court. Because while the Queen was doing everything in her scented, powdered power to mask her own bodily realities, she was surrounded constantly by dozens, sometimes hundreds of courtiers doing, well, absolutely nothing to help the situation. Welcome to the Elizabethan court, where ruffs were starched, shoes were velvet, and the collective smell could bring a tear to your eye, and not from patriotism. Let's start with the numbers. Elizabeth's court wasn't just a handful of well-behaved nobles sipping wine by the fire. At any given time, there were between 100 and 400 people moving through her private and public spaces, advisors, ladies-in-waiting, pages, bodyguards, musicians, clergymen, foreign envoys, cooks, and assorted hangers-on hoping to curry favour. That meant dozens of bodies in a single corridor, layered in unwashed clothes, sweating under heavy fabrics, sharing air in poorly ventilated rooms. Imagine cramming into an elevator with 50 people wearing wool in the summer, and then staying there for hours, with incense, and poultry, and no deodorant. The Queen's daily rituals made things worse. Ceremonial dinners, council meetings, religious services, dance performances, all of them required an audience. Rooms packed shoulder to shoulder, with courtiers breathing hotly into one another's collars, trying to appear refined while their bodies cried out for mercy. The The Queen could mask herself in powder and perfume, but the courtiers? They tried, bless them, but the stench always won. Clothing was part of the problem. Elizabeth's sumptuary laws dictated what people could wear based on rank, and nobles weren't about to show up in anything simple. Everyone was trying to impress, and that meant layers. Doublets, hose, gowns, cloaks, even fur linings in warmer months. All that fabric, rarely washed, soaking up sweat, spilled wine, and whatever the kitchens were churning out that day. And these weren't breathable fibres. We're talking brocade, damask, velvet. Fabrics that turned human beings into elegant slow cookers. Let's not forget footwear. Leather shoes, often lined with wool or silk, were worn for months at a time. No socks, no foot powder, no mercy. The floors of the palace were covered in rushes or carpets, sometimes sprinkled with herbs to refresh the air, but these were rarely replaced and never scrubbed. Beneath the surface, decades of crushed food, mould, rat droppings and mud. When someone walked through the court, they were stirring up a historical stew of every foot that had ever come before them. The air itself was a sensory gauntlet. Scented candles and incense burned constantly, attempting to mask the funk with musk and myrrh. But all that did was mingle the smells into something more confusing. One courtier famously described the air in Whitehall Palace as smelling of soap, wine, fire, and man, which is poetic, sure, but mostly means it smelled like a battlefield between good intentions and biological truths. There's a weird little fringe fact about court etiquette. Everyone carried scented items, fans, gloves, handkerchiefs, pomanders. If you were in the Queen's presence, it was understood that you'd come bearing your own olfactory defences. Nosegays, little bouquets of herbs and flowers, were fashionable accessories, and not just for the aesthetic. People literally held them to their noses to avoid passing out during ceremonies. It's like having a floral gas mask on standby at all times. Even Elizabeth wasn't immune to the ambient stink. Her famously sharp tongue often came out during long court events, and some historians believe that her irritability wasn't just political, it was physical. Imagine trying to project power while the air is thick with armpit, garlic breath, and damp wool. There are unconfirmed rumours that she occasionally ordered windows smashed open in moments of desperation just to let in some air. More likely she simply retreated, stepping away from the masses into the relatively calmer but still rank air of her privy chamber. And it wasn't just the bodies. The court's diet didn't help. Rich, heavy foods, roasted meats, spiced sauces, gallons of wine led to a population constantly digesting. Flatulence, burping and sour breath were all regular companions to courtly dialogue. Add to that the reality that toilet facilities were minimal, and you begin to understand just how heroic it was for anyone to survive a council meeting without openly gagging. There's a scholarly debate about whether Elizabeth noticed the full sensory weight of her court or had grown desensitized. Some suggest she had a heightened sensitivity to smells and strategically arranged her rooms to avoid being downwind from particularly offensive courtiers. Others argue that she, like most people of her time, simply didn't register the stink because there was no such thing as fresh by modern standards. Clean was a visual concept. If you looked tidy, you were assumed to be fine, even if your smell could knock over a horse. To cope, the court created rituals. People bowed from a distance. They kept their hands clasped, partly out of decorum, partly to avoid spreading the stink of touch. Conversation was often conducted at an angle, avoiding full face-to-face confrontation, and if someone really offended the Queen's nostrils, they were gently but firmly removed. Disgraceful? Perhaps, but also merciful. It's hard to overstate how much of Elizabeth's reign was managed through illusion, not just of politics or divinity, but of cleanliness. The court was a theatre, each person playing a role, the noble, the lady, the priest, the diplomat, and all of them were pretending not to notice the smell rising around them like smoke. Everyone in pearls and powdered wigs smiling politely as their corsets soaked up centuries of other people's sweat. And yet, despite it all, the court functioned. Policy was made, deals were struck, poems were written, marriages were arranged, all beneath a chandelier of stink, because Elizabeth's court, like Elizabeth herself, was not clean, but it was powerful. It didn't smell like heaven, it smelled like survival. So next time you're trapped in an elevator with someone wearing too much cologne, close your eyes and imagine you're in the Tudor court, nosegay in hand, ruff around your neck, praying that the noble next to you had the decency to air out his cloak sometime this decade. We've waded through the steaming corridors of Elizabethan court life, dodged chamber pots, endured the royal toothaches, and sniffed perfumed gloves with cautious reverence. But now, let's turn to one of the most curious and revealing artifacts of daily life in Elizabeth's England, the nosegay. It sounds delicate, doesn't it? Like something you'd tuck behind your ear or lay gently on a pillow. But in the 16th century, a nosegay wasn't just a sweet floral arrangement, it was a survival mechanism, a fragrant defence system in a world where walking outside meant plunging nose first into the foulest smells history could cook up. A nosegay, or posy as it was sometimes called, was a small bouquet of tightly bound flowers and herbs, designed to be carried by hand or pinned to clothing. It wasn't meant to decorate a room or cheer up a friend, it was meant to block out the relentless sark of everyday Tudor life. That included human waste, unwashed bodies, rotting food, dead animals in the street, and whatever nightmares were currently brewing in the Thames. If you had a nose and lived in Elizabethan England, chances are it spent most of the day under siege. Elizabeth's court embraced the nosegay with enthusiasm. The Queen herself is said to have carried one on many public occasions, especially during plague seasons or hot weather. She might be seen ascending the steps of a cathedral, nosegay held just beneath her nose, appearing to smell the roses while actually shielding herself from the collective scent of 300 sweating nobles packed into a stone sanctuary. And the nosegay wasn't subtle either. It was stuffed with lavender, rosemary, marjoram, mint, sage, and sometimes even garlic. These weren't dainty little sniff and smile bouquets, these were olfactory smoke bombs. Some were simple, a small clutch of herbs tied with ribbon. Others were elaborate, tucked into ornate silver holders called posy rings or pomander chains worn around the neck or wrist. Elizabeth, ever the icon of fashion and survival, likely had a collection of custom nosegay holders designed to match her gowns. They weren't just accessories, they were armour. Scented shields to keep her safe from what she believed to be toxic air. And here is where things get even weirder. Nosegays weren't just used for bad smells, they were believed to protect against disease itself. According to the miasma theory of medicine, still popular in Elizabeth's day, illness was caused by bad air, or foul-smelling vapours that crept into your body through the nose and mouth. So if you could smell something pleasant instead, you were protecting yourself. A good scent, in this logic, was like a sponge that soaked up the sickness before it reached your lungs. This belief went deep. Physicians carried long sticks tipped with bundles of herbs to wave in front of their faces. Apothecaries sold plague bags, small pouches of dried flowers and spices to wear under your clothes. And Elizabeth's court. They turned the whole thing into a kind of silent choreography. During sermons or processions, courtiers might suddenly lift their nosegays, not in reverence or rapture, but because someone nearby shifted and released a day's worth of stale velvet musk into the air. It became a kind of coded language. Nosegay up, someone's rank today is more than just social. One strange little detail buried in ambassador reports. Elizabeth sometimes had fresh herbs scattered along the floor of her chambers, particularly mint, sage and lavender, so when people walked across the room the pressure released bursts of scent. The floor, in effect, became one giant passive nosegay. It may have made things slightly more bearable, but it also meant the Queen's chambers permanently smelled like an upscale butcher's shop and a potpourri stand had thrown a party and no one cleaned up. There's also a fringe belief among some scholars that nosegays had a psychological role for Elizabeth, something closer to self-soothing. They were a way to retreat from the world while still being in it. Surrounded by advisors, diplomats and nervous ladies in waiting, she could lift the nosegay, take a deep breath and remind herself that beneath the perfume, the pomp and the pressure, she was still a body surviving in a hostile world. It was the only private moment she could take in public, disguised as fashion. But of course, nosegays had their limits. If you were seated next to someone whose ruff had absorbed a week's worth of sweat and starch, a handful of rosemary wasn't going to save you. And during court events, when candles heated the room and every body in it, the air thickened until no amount of lavender could cut through it. There were probably moments, plenty of them, when even Elizabeth lowered her nosegay and just accepted her fate. And that fate smelled like damp wool, burning tallow, and ambition. And yet she insisted on them, every day. New herbs were delivered to the palace regularly. The gardeners at Hampton Court and Richmond grew entire plots of rosemary, lavender and sweet basil just for these little scented bundles. Servants were tasked with arranging them each morning, tying the stems with silk ribbon, refreshing the flowers midday if they wilted. It was a whole operation just to keep the Queen's nose happy, or at least distracted. And there was politics in it too. A nosegay wasn't just for smelling, it was for giving. Courtiers offered them as signs of favour. Foreign envoys presented them as diplomatic gifts, hoping their local herbs might charm the Queen, or at least buy her a few seconds of cleaner air. It was a way to say, I understand what you're dealing with, Your Majesty, and I'm here to help you pretend it doesn't exist. There's something deeply symbolic in all of this. The Queen, seated on a throne of power, dressed in layers of gold-threaded cloth, holding a tiny bouquet of mint and marjoram between her gloved fingers, breathing in a fantasy while the world around her fermented. It's the perfect image of Elizabethan hygiene, beautiful, performative, fragrant, and completely overwhelmed by reality. So next time you light a scented candle or spritz air freshener after someone's been less than royal in the bathroom, think of Elizabeth, nosegay in hand, head held high, pretending just for a moment that everything didn't absolutely reek. If you've stayed with me this far, you're already emotionally prepared for anything Elizabeth IV's hygiene situation can throw at you. Or so you think. But tonight, let's take a little journey outside the palace walls. Not far, just a few miles, following Elizabeth as she travelled across her realm on one of her famous royal progresses. These were long, ceremonial road trips where the Queen and her massive entourage would descend upon the estates of her nobles, bringing prestige, pressure, and roughly 300 hungry, sweating courtiers. But along with the musicians, guards, and diplomats came something a bit more personal. Her toilet. Yes, Elizabeth travelled with her own portable commode, and you better believe it had a throne-like presence of its own. She didn't trust just any chamber to house the royal bottom. She brought her own travelling stool, complete with a velvet-lined seat, a silver or pewter chamber pot hidden underneath, and a team of servants who were extremely familiar with its operation. So while the rest of the countryside was still squatting behind bushes and hoping for the best, Elizabeth had a travelling lavatory that was part status symbol, part survival strategy. But before we give her too much credit for pioneering hygiene on the go, let's be clear, this toilet wasn't exactly hygienic. It wasn't plumbed, it wasn't cleaned with antiseptic wipes, it wasn't discreet. When nature called, the Queen would step behind a screen or into a tent, the stool would be placed beneath her, and attendants would stand just beyond the curtain, waiting for the soft sound of history in the making. And when she finished, someone, an extremely loyal someone, would whisk the contents away in a sealed container and dispose of it in whatever method the local lord had hastily arranged. A ditch, a pit, maybe a poorly chosen pond. If you were the noble lucky enough to host the Queen, you had two jobs: prepare an extravagant feast and figure out where her bodily waste was going to go. One documented account from a 1578 progress in Norfolk mentions a panicked scramble when the Queen arrived early, and the estate's designated privy tent had not been properly aired out from the previous use. The result? An emergency redirection to the kitchens while servants tried to fan out the odour with rushes and incense. Yes, the Queen of England had to wait because her outdoor toilet wasn't fresh enough, and somehow she didn't fire everyone involved on the spot. Maybe she was having a good day. Let's talk logistics for a moment. Elizabeth's progresses lasted weeks, sometimes months. She visited up to 20 estates in a single summer, each stop requiring careful planning. And among the many details her advance team had to consider, food, beds, security, was the royal toilet situation. Would her stool fit in the designated chamber? Could it be placed near a window without creating a diplomatic incident? Was there a safe path for the groom of the stool to carry out the goods without encountering a confused French ambassador in the hallway? And while we're here, let's take a second to appreciate that title again. Groom of the stool. This was not a joke role. It was one of the most trusted positions in the royal household. The groom managed all matters related to the Queen's bodily functions, her close stool, her linens, her chamber pot schedule, and far from being a punishment, it was a political stepping stone, because when you handle a monarch's bathroom needs, you earn their trust, and that trust translated into influence. Several grooms of the stool went on to high-ranking political careers. Turns out, if you clean up after royalty well enough, you might just get to rule beside them. Of course, Elizabeth's portable toilet wasn't her only travel companion. She also brought her own bedding, tapestries, clothing, hundreds of pounds of it, and perfumes. But the stool held a unique position, handled unnecessary and deeply awkward. It was packed with care, carried with discretion, and set up with the kind of reverence usually reserved for relics. because even on the road the Queen had to maintain the illusion. The public saw a flawless monarch stepping out of a litter in a jewel-toned gown. They didn't see the velvet box she'd perched on an hour earlier, shaded by a silk tent and surrounded by whispering attendants praying the pot didn't spill. And yes, it spilled. At least once, according to a letter from an irritated nobleman whose estate suffered the misfortune of overturned privyware on his garden path. No further details were provided, which is a mercy, but we can assume it wasn't a highlight of his career. There's a scholarly debate about whether Elizabeth actually used the stool during every stop or simply held it in reserve, like an emergency parachute. Some argue she was skilled at avoiding public bodily functions altogether, limiting her food and drink during travel days to avoid having to go. Others think she used the stool discreetly and frequently, especially as she aged and long rides became more difficult. But either way, the stool was there, always, waiting, lined in velvet, smelling faintly of herbs and inevitability. One fringe detail from her wardrobe records mentions a privy cover of satin lined with buckram, likely a cloth drape used to preserve the Queen's modesty during outdoor bathroom use. It was stitched with gold thread, because even her privacy had to sparkle. And maybe that's the heart of it. Elizabeth wasn't just managing an empire. She was managing her body, every creak, ache, and embarrassing function. She was keeping it hidden, wrapped in ritual, trailing behind her on a gilded litter, followed by a stool in a box that told the quietest, most human story of them all. The Queen went places, and where she went, her toilet went too. So the next time you complain about a gas station restroom on a road trip, just remember Elizabeth I. Somewhere outside a manor house in midsummer, squatting above a velvet-lined box surrounded by nervously coughing servants and the scent of sage. Ruling, always ruling, even from the seat of necessity. Now that we've followed Elizabeth's perfumed toilet across the countryside, it's time to descend into the murky depths of Tudor medical theory, the strange, semi-magical worldview that shaped every part of the Queen's hygiene, or lack thereof. Tonight, we're unpacking one of the most misunderstood and flat-out bizarre belief systems of the age, the smell theory of health. You've heard of germ theory, this isn't that. This is the very real idea that smells, particularly bad smells, weren't just unpleasant, but deadly. Welcome to a world where sniffing the wrong air could kill you, and the nose became the ultimate diagnostic tool. In Elizabeth's court, the dominant belief was that disease came not from invisible bacteria, but from miasma, poisonous vapours rising from rotting material, waste, or just plain filth. Decaying animal, dangerous, a sweaty servant, probably lethal. That rank alley behind the palace kitchens, a potential gateway to plague. They believed that the air itself became corrupted, and once inhaled, those foul particles would disturb your body's delicate balance of humours and throw you into illness. So what did this mean for daily life? Everything. It meant that people spent enormous amounts of time and money not actually cleaning their environments, but masking the smells with fragrant distractions. Elizabeth's chambers were loaded with dried herbs, citrus peels and aromatic wood. Her clothes were lined with sachets of lavender and rosemary, not just because she liked the scent, but because she genuinely believed these fragrances could block illness. Smelling good wasn't vanity, it was survival. The Queen even employed special staff to manage her indoor air quality. One of her lesser-known attendants, sometimes referred to as the spicer, was tasked with preparing the scented materials for her chambers. Tapestries were perfumed, floors were sprinkled with herbs, and perfumes were burned in small clay pots called censers. She wasn't just trying to impress visitors, she was building an invisible shield against disease. Here's a historical gem. During outbreaks of plague, Elizabeth wouldn't just avoid contact with the sick, she would avoid entire districts of her realm. She retreated to country houses and insisted that every room be purified with a mixture of vinegar and herbs before she entered. Vinegar in particular was considered a kind of magical disinfectant. Not because it killed germs, they didn't know germs existed, but because its strong smell was thought to overpower the dangerous vapours that caused plague. So in practice, she was breathing a cloud of floral-scented salad dressing every time she changed locations, and when someone did fall ill, their rooms were subjected to what could only be described as a fragrant exorcism. Carpets were beaten and dusted with powder. Bowls of vinegar were set near windows. Tar or pitch might be burned to smoke out corruption. In extreme cases, Walls were whitewashed with lime to contain the infection, and the poor patient, often confined to a small bedchamber surrounded by herbs, candles, and absolutely no understanding of what was actually happening. This smell theory extended to personal health as well. If someone smelled off, it was taken as a sign that their body was unbalanced. Strong breath, rotten humours, too much sweat, overactive liver, even flatulence had diagnostic value. It wasn't rude, it was informative. The Queen's physicians used scent as a primary method of diagnosis, often inspecting the smell of urine or breath before deciding on treatment. Forget blood tests. Just breathe near the court doctor and wait for him to grimace. There's a strange and delightful fringe belief that Elizabeth once refused to enter a particular London residence because the entrance hall smelled of mildew and despair. Now, did she say that verbatim? Probably not. But we do know she was highly sensitive to odours and refused to visit places she deemed unclean, even when political necessity demanded it. Her nose, in this case, overruled her advisors. Interestingly, this obsession with avoiding bad smells created a bizarre paradox. In trying to protect themselves from illness, Elizabeth and her court often ended up trapping the very dangers they feared. Rooms were sealed tight to keep out miasma, but that also meant body odour, smoke, and other delightful aromas had nowhere to go. Layers of perfume mingled with human funk until the air itself became a thick, invisible soup. Because the smells were masked, not removed, people assumed the danger had passed. It's important to note that this wasn't foolishness. Elizabeth and her advisors weren't stupid. They were working with the best science of the time. They saw a clear connection between smell, and sickness. And in some cases, they weren't entirely wrong. Filthy environments did lead to disease. They just didn't understand why. The smells were a symptom, not the cause, but lacking microscopes or germ theory, they did what they could. They covered the rot with roses and hoped it wouldn't kill them. One truly strange royal remedy tied to this theory involved something called vinegar of the four thieves, a potent mix of vinegar, garlic and herbs said to protect against plague. Legend had it that a band of robbers used this concoction to loot the homes of plague victims without getting sick. Elizabeth's apothecaries may have brewed their own versions, and it's likely that her perfume blends, those clove-heavy oils and flour-drenched handkerchiefs, were inspired by this same idea: survival through scent. There's still scholarly debate about whether Elizabeth ever doubted the smell theory. Some letters suggest she occasionally rolled her eyes at her physician's paranoia. Others argue that her fastidiousness about scented linens and fresh herbs proves she took the concept very seriously. What we know for sure is that she spent a fortune on fragrance, not just for pleasure, but as part of her medical toolkit. Her body, her bed, even her throne were fortified with aromatherapy. So the next time you open a window to clear the air, or light a candle to make your home feel cozy, just remember, you're tapping into a centuries-old belief that good smells keep evil away. Elizabeth lived by that rule, she ruled by it. And for over 40 years it seemed to work. She outlived her enemies, her rivals, and more than a few of her own physicians. Not because she bathed, not because she flossed, but maybe, just maybe, because she never let the stink get too close. Let's slow things down for a second and drift into the heart of Elizabeth's nighttime rituals. After the trumpets fell silent and the courtiers finally stopped bowing and complimenting each other's sleeves, the Queen would retreat to her private chambers, those sacred inner sanctums where very few were allowed and even fewer understood what went on behind the curtains. You might imagine a bit of luxury there. Maybe silk sheets, a soft fire, someone reading her poetry while she sipped wine. And sure, there were moments of that, but mostly, her nights were about controlling the chaos of her body, through ritual, powder, and the careful art of not unravelling. Because if daylight was about performance, the nighttime was damage control. Her bed itself was the centrepiece of the room, enormous, draped with layers of heavy tapestries to keep out drafts, and raised so high off the floor that she needed a footstool to climb into it. This wasn't just comfort, it was defence. The elevated bed kept her away from cold air, rats, and anything else lurking near the floorboards. It also made her look, even in sleep, slightly above the rest of humanity, a literal sleeping goddess. Except that beneath those velvet blankets, things got surprisingly unsanitary. For starters, Elizabeth slept in makeup. Not because she wanted to, but because it was almost impossible to remove. Her signature white lead face paint was waterproof, sweatproof, and resistant to even the most aggressive scrubbing. which meant that unless she went through a painstaking, hours-long vinegar and oil routine, the paint stayed on, night after night, day after day. This created a vicious cycle. The paint ruined her skin, so she wore more paint to cover the damage, which caused more damage. By the end of her reign, her complexion beneath the mask was said to be mottled, scarred, and visibly deteriorating. But still she slept in it, because to show her real skin, even in the privacy of her chambers, was too great a risk, and she didn't sleep alone. Not in the modern sense, anyway. Elizabeth was usually surrounded by attendants, chambermaids, ladies-in-waiting, bodyguards just beyond the doors. A select few of her ladies were always within earshot. They prepared her bed, adjusted her linens, fluffed her pillows, and, yes, sometimes helped her undress. But the Queen's bedtime undressing wasn't what you'd expect. She rarely removed everything. Her undergarments stayed on, as did layers of linen, and possibly even her corset, depending on her condition. Total nudity, even in private, was considered dangerous, inviting bad air, spiritual vulnerability, and worst of all, wrinkles. Speaking of wrinkles, Elizabeth had something close to a nightly skincare routine, although it wouldn't exactly pass modern dermatological approval. Her maids would gently wipe her face with soft cloths dipped in rosewater or vinegar, trying to reduce the crust of cosmetics without disturbing the delicate mask. Then came the powders, layers of starch, crushed pearls, or finely ground rice flour, applied to refresh the face. The goal was to wake looking as untouched as possible. Her pillows were likely embroidered silk, sometimes stuffed with herbs, or even little sachets of dried flowers, which she believed helped maintain her scent and skin health overnight. She also likely used scented linens, not just for pleasure, but again, for protection. Lavender, rose petals, and camphor were favourites, thought to ward off infection and improve the balance of the humours. So as she lay under thick perfumed sheets, Elizabeth wasn't just sleeping, she was healing, or at least trying to undo the daily damage done by lead, mercury, and an exhausting calendar of flattery and fear. Let's not forget hair. Elizabeth wore wigs, of course, dozens of them, each more elaborate than the last. But under those wigs was her real hair, thinning, likely brittle from years of tightly fastened styles and chemical treatments. At night, her ladies might apply oils, perhaps almond or rosemary, and wrap her head in soft cloths to preserve what was left. Some accounts suggest she even wore head coverings in bed to retain heat and encourage circulation of humours. Whether it helped is up for debate, but the symbolism was clear. Even her hair was on a schedule. Then there's the fringe stuff, little details that creep in around the edges of the historical record. Some sources claim Elizabeth slept with a dagger under her pillow. Others say she kept a small prayer book or rosary in her hands, which she clutched while drifting off. Both are believable. She was, after all, ruling a country that was constantly trying to depose or assassinate her. Sleep wasn't just a luxury, it was a risk. There's even a theory that Elizabeth had trouble sleeping. Insomnia, in her case, would make perfect sense. The constant worry, the endless rituals, the heavy bedclothes, the lingering pain from her teeth or skin. It's easy to imagine her lying awake long after the candles burned low, staring into the canopy overhead and replaying conversations from court, or silently mouthing prayers that her body would hold itself together just a little longer. One historical detail we do have is that she rose early, often before sunrise. Despite the lack of restful sleep, Elizabeth was a morning monarch. She received reports in bed, heard petitions while sipping warm ale or posset, a kind of spiced milk, and began preparing for the day's grand deception before the palace even stirred. Her ladies would help her dress, reapply her makeup, and by the time her courtiers caught their first glimpse, the transformation would be complete. The radiant queen, composed, ageless, and terrifying. And yet, every night it all unravelled again. The powder flaked, the sweat built up, the linens grew stale, her skin cracked beneath the lead, and so she returned to her scented cocoon, surrounded by layers of silk and secrecy, and did her best to pretend, at least to herself, that she was still winning the war against time and decay. So the next time you crawl into bed, clean sheets, maybe a dab of lavender on your wrist, maybe a little night cream and a podcast to lull you to sleep, think of Elizabeth. Her bed 10 feet wide, her face still painted, her chambermaids whispering in the dark, her dagger under the pillow, and the deep or silent hope that she'd wake up with her illusion still intact. let's pull back the curtains and peek into one of the strangest paradoxes of Elizabeth of Ort's world. For someone surrounded by filth, disease, and a painfully limited understanding of cleanliness, she was obsessed with order. Not just political order, though she certainly ruled with a famously iron will, but bodily and behavioural order too. In the Queen's eyes, messiness was a kind of moral failure, and so every element of her court, down to the folding of a napkin or the position of a stool and not the seating kind, was arranged, corrected, and then arranged again. Because behind all that filth, Elizabeth was a neat freak, a micromanager, a monarch whose sense of control extended all the way to your breath, your bow, and probably your socks. Start with her chambers. Despite what we've already established about the grim realities of 16th century cleanliness, Elizabeth's personal rooms were, by comparison, pristine. Not sterile, don't get carried away, but meticulously arranged. Her tables were always laid out in symmetrical order. Her grooming items were placed in precise positions on her dressing table. Her linens, while rarely washed, were folded just so. There was a hierarchy to the towels, a designated method for laying out her robes. Even her herbal sachets had to be rotated and replaced according to a system only her closest ladies understood. There's a report from one foreign envoy who marvelled at the almost military discipline of Elizabeth's dressing ritual. Everything was prepared in advance. The gown chosen, the jewels selected, the gloves pre-scented. Her hairpieces were brushed and sorted by shade. And if something was out of place, the Queen noticed, immediately, one wrong brush, one crooked pin, one glove too limp, and the unfortunate lady responsible would receive a sharp glance that, in the Tudor court, was a near-death experience. But her obsession with order wasn't limited to her wardrobe. It extended to her court, her meals, her public appearances, even her thoughts. Elizabeth structured her day with relentless precision. Morning reports, midday consultations, afternoon audiences, evening prayers, even her so-called leisure, music, walks, dancing, was slotted into carefully maintained windows. Time was not a river, it was a chessboard. And every piece had to move exactly where she wanted it. This sense of control wasn't just about efficiency, it was about image. Elizabeth believed, with good reason, that if she faltered in one area, even in private, it would echo across her entire reign. She couldn't let the chaos of lice, of dental agony, of hidden bleeding and midnight dread show, so she clung to ritual, to perfection, to things being just so. It was the only way to drown out the noise of decay. Take, for instance, her signature temper. Courtiers learned quickly that the Queen had no tolerance for sloppiness, not in speech, not in grooming, not in bodily presentation. A wrinkled sleeve, disrespect. A mismatched accessory, treason adjacent. Even the way one bowed was subject to royal scrutiny. There are recorded instances of courtiers being publicly rebuked for failing to bow low enough or long enough, and if they smelled bad, if their breath was off or their hands too damp, forget it, you might as well climb into the stocks. One delightfully absurd fringe fact. Elizabeth once delayed an entire audience with foreign diplomats because she was displeased with how her jewels had been arranged on her gown. She kept them waiting for over an hour while her maids repinned everything, just to ensure the effect was correct. Was it vanity? Maybe. But more than that, it was about asserting control over her appearance, and therefore her power. This obsession with symmetry and control filtered into her letters too. Elizabeth's handwriting, though famously spidery, was consistent. Her phrasing was deliberate. Her correspondence was edited, then edited again. She did not allow emotional sloppiness. Not in her pen, not in her posture, not in her politics. Every sentence was another brick in the fortress she built around herself. Scholars still debate whether this behaviour was a response to trauma. Her mother beheaded, her sister's reign soaked in blood, and her own crown constantly threatened, or simply a survival strategy. Most agree it was both. A young woman forced to live under suspicion and surveillance learns quickly that control is the only protection. So Elizabeth made her world a clockwork machine, ticking forward on scented gears and velvet cushions, and punished anything that threatened to throw it off. That's not to say she was cold. On the contrary, her letters to friends and favourites are full of warmth, wit, and a biting sense of humour. But even those moments were polished. The public never saw her off guard, never slouching, never red-eyed or out of breath. Even in her old age, when her body was failing and the mask harder to maintain, she held fast to the illusion. One of her final audiences before her death was delivered standing, because to sit to appear weak was unthinkable. But behind all that perfection was the rot, the untreated infections, the lice burrowing deeper, the paint sinking into her pores, the silks that hadn't touched water in years, and still she pressed on, adjusting her ruff, straightening a glove, dismissing a servant with a wave of the perfectly angled hand. Even her rage was symmetrical. And let's not forget her throne room, the most controlled space in the kingdom. It was arranged like a stage, with Elizabeth at its centre, lit by candles, framed by curtains, surrounded by exactly the right number of advisors at exactly the right distance. No one was allowed too close. No one saw the Queen's sweat. And while her body may have been decaying under that gown, what everyone saw was order, structure, majesty. So when you picture Elizabeth of Worst now, powdered, poised, her every move choreographed, remember that behind her was a palace of filth and noise, but she kept it at bay, not with soap, not with sanitation, but with structure. She controlled her body through force of will, and when that failed, she controlled everyone else's perception of it. Because in Elizabeth's world, cleanliness wasn't just about soap and water. It was about symmetry, about ritual, about keeping the illusion from collapsing under the weight of sweat, lice, and reality. And in that way, she was spotless. Now imagine just for a moment that you've been invited into Elizabeth's bedchamber, not as a visitor, not as a noble seeking favour, but as someone truly inside the inner circle. One of her most trusted ladies in waiting. It's late. The candles are burning low, the Queen is seated at her dressing table, the air thick with the mingled scents of rose oil, lavender sachets, and that ever-present undertone of sweat and starch. She lets out a long breath, not dramatic, not performative, but just tired. You see her hands tremble slightly as she removes a ring, and suddenly in that moment you realise something truly unsettling. The most powerful woman in the world is also the most fragile thing in the room. This was the secret truth behind all the ritual, all the order, all the powdered illusion. Elizabeth was holding herself together, literally and symbolically, with pins, paint and pure willpower. And as her reign wore on and the years took their toll, that facade became harder and harder to maintain. The ageing Queen's hygiene, already eccentric, now drifted towards something even stranger, and something closer to denial. Let's start with her hair. By the late 1590s, Elizabeth had lost most of it. Years of tight wigs, lead-based cosmetics, and general neglect had left her scalp nearly bald. Rather than embracing a simpler style or switching to more breathable headwear, she doubled down. Her wigs became even more elaborate, more gravity-defying. Where once she favoured simple curls, she now wore towering creations adorned with pearls, lace, and sometimes even miniature ship motifs. Each one was powdered, perfumed, and meticulously fitted. And underneath? A patchy scalp, scabbed and likely infected, hidden beneath a mountain of artificial majesty. The same went for her makeup. By this point, her complexion was more mask than skin. She'd suffered from smallpox in 1562, leaving her with facial scarring that she never forgot or forgave. To cover the marks, she began applying more and more Venetian ceruse, that deadly mixture of white lead and vinegar. She layered it until her face was a chalky, almost ghost-like white. Add to that a blush made from cinnabar, a mercury-based pigment, and you have the perfect recipe for systemic poisoning. And yet she never stopped. Even when her skin began to flake, even when open sores appeared along her jaw and hairline, she ordered her ladies to touch up the paint with tiny brushes, to smooth over cracks like plaster on a crumbling wall. There are descriptions, whispered ones, of what she looked like in the privacy of her chambers, blotchy, sunken, visibly ill, but in public, she was still the glowing, untouchable Virgin Queen. There's something tragic in how tightly she clung to that image. Other monarchs aged. Elizabeth refused. And it wasn't just about pride, it was about power. In a patriarchal world, a woman's youth was her currency. A youthful queen was considered strong, fertile, blessed. An aging queen, unmarried, childless, increasingly isolated, risked looking weak. And weakness in Elizabeth's world was the beginning of the end. That fear ran deep. In the final years of her reign, she began to avoid mirrors. According to one of her ladies, she ordered all mirrors removed from her chambers. Not a single reflective surface remained. Whether out of superstition, sadness, or simply practicality, She could no longer face the truth of what time had done to her. She didn't want to see the creases in her skin, the sunken eyes, the raw patches where makeup had eaten through flesh. She wanted to see only what the world saw, a radiant, eternal monarch suspended in amber. Her hygiene, already theatrical, became more like set dressing. Her gowns grew stiffer, heavier, more embroidered. Her ruffs rose higher, forming almost a barrier between her chin and the rest of the world. She wore gloves constantly, often perfumed to the point of nausea, to mask any trace of decay. There are accounts of her speech growing shorter, less frequent, perhaps because of the pain in her jaw or the rot in her mouth. But no one said a word. Everyone just kept bowing. And still she worked. She read state papers, she met with her counsel, she practiced her speeches. Even as her health declined, she refused to stop. In the winter of 1602, she fell into a deep melancholia following the death of her beloved confidant, the Countess of Nottingham. She stopped sleeping, stopped eating. She stood for hours, silent, refusing to lie down, surrounded by worried courtiers who didn't dare touch her. Her hair hung limp, her makeup was smeared, her breath, one diplomat noted, was rank with Cecil's sickness. But she wouldn't let go, not of her body, not of the throne, not of the myth. One fringe account suggests that in those final days she refused all medical treatments. She would not take potions, she would not allow leeches, she would not be bled. She didn't trust her physicians anymore, didn't want anyone to know how much she'd unravelled. To accept help was to admit weakness. And so she stood night after night, slumped beneath the weight of her robes, the scent of roses and vinegar clinging to her like a memory, waiting perhaps for death to arrive on her own terms. There's debate among historians about her exact cause of death. Some say it was pneumonia. Others suggest blood poisoning from the constant use of lead and mercury. Still others point to sheer exhaustion. But whatever the mechanism, the result was the same. Elizabeth died surrounded by attendants who barely recognised the woman they'd once worshipped. Her body was frail, her skin brittle, her teeth mostly gone, her wig removed, her real face laid bare, and even then the image mattered. Her body was dressed in full regalia. Her coffin was draped in purple velvet. A wax effigy, youthful, flawless, was displayed above her, so that the people would remember that version of her, the mask, not the woman. So next time you see one of those portraits, Elizabeth in gleaming white, clutching a sceptre, her gaze unflinching, know what it cost her to look that way. Know what hid beneath the powder and pearls. A body that flinched, a mouth that ached, a queen who clung to beauty not because she loved it, but because she needed it. She was dying, slowly, every day, and she never let anyone see it. And here we are, the final chapter in the song, perfumed, powdered, gloriously grotesque story. You've seen Elizabeth Ferguson from every uncomfortable angle. The smeared white paint, the aching teeth, the corset-pressed cramps, the damp gloves, the velvet toilet. You've smelled the lavender disguises and the courtier-stewed air, sat stiffly through her night rituals. And now, at the very end, you're probably wondering one thing. Why did she do all of this? Why live inside such relentless, meticulous discomfort? Why go to such lengths to keep up appearances when her body was clearly waging war against her? Because Elizabeth wasn't just a queen, she was an idea. A living, breathing icon forged in the pressure cooker of English politics, religious unrest, patriarchal fear, and the sharp end of a sword. And ideas? Ideas don't sweat, they don't age, they don't need to bathe. From the moment she took the throne in 1558, Elizabeth's reign was about more than governance. It was about survival, physical, political, symbolic. She was expected to be everything her predecessors were not. A Protestant saviour, a strong monarch, a virgin goddess, a unifying figure. To fail in any of these was to unravel the entire fragile fabric of her legitimacy. So she leaned into the myth, hard. She became the glittering virgin queen, untouched, ageless, wise beyond mortality, and she used her very body as the canvas. It was an exhausting, dangerous performance. Every inch of her, skin, hair, teeth, scent, had to be managed. Not simply cleaned, but curated. This wasn't about hygiene in the modern sense. It was about control. Each decision, from skipping a bath to layering on lead paint, was a calculated risk in the service of power. She didn't want to appear clean. She wanted to appear immaculate. Her courtiers played along. They didn't challenge the illusion, even when the cracks began to show. They saw the sores beneath the paint, smelled the decay beneath the perfume, heard the rattle in her breath, and they bowed anyway. Because the real horror wasn't in what they saw, it was in what would happen if she stopped pretending. She understood the stakes better than anyone. England wasn't ready for a mortal queen, not one who got sick or bled or wept in her chambers when no one was watching. So she gave them something else, something impossible, and they worshipped it. That's the strange truth about Elizabeth's hygiene. It was never about cleanliness, it was about mythology. She didn't wash to feel fresh, she didn't perfume to smell nice. She did it to build a fortress out of silk and scent to armour herself against time, decay and political obliteration. The woman became a ritual, repeated every morning and every night. Powder, gloves, scent, silence. All of it held together with the thinnest of threads and the heaviest of expectations. And for over 4 decades it worked. Elizabeth ruled longer than any English monarch before her. She survived conspiracies, assassination attempts, foreign invasions, internal rebellions, and constant pressure to marry. She built a cult of personality so powerful that it outlived her body. To this day, people remember her as brilliant, brave, resolute. But what's forgotten, what's quietly erased in the oil portraits and heroic epics, is just how much she suffered to be seen that way. That suffering wasn't accidental, it was part of the job. Elizabeth sacrificed comfort, health, and eventually her own flesh to stay in power. And she did it with a straight spine, a stiff collar, and a face full of powder. Even now, historians still debate what to make of her. Was she vain or shrewd? A victim of her time or its master? Did she believe her own legend? Or was she simply too deep into the performance to step away? One thing is certain, she was the last person who could afford to be honest. The moment she let the mask fall, even a little, she risked everything. Not just her own dignity, but the stability of an entire nation. So she kept going, until the very end. Until she could no longer stand. Until her body finally gave out under the weight of 50 pounds of fabric and 50 years of denial. And even then, her legend was preserved. The portraits remained untouched. The stories softened. The real woman, with her bleeding gums and foul breath and insomnia and layered shame, faded beneath the gold paint and Latin mottos. Because history loves a symbol, especially one who refuses to crack. But tonight, you've seen what lay beneath the lace and ruff. The sweat, the blood, the pain, the sheer relentless effort it took to pretend that Elizabeth I did not smell like every other human on earth. And maybe, just maybe, there's a little comfort in that. Because if even the Virgin Queen had lice, skipped baths, wore a velvet toilet seat and lived in fear of her own reflection, well, then maybe we're all doing just fine. So now that we've survived the powdered gauntlet of Elizabeth of Beauvai's personal hygiene, or the shimmering illusion of it, you can let out a breath. A real one. The kind that doesn't reek of clove-stuffed pomanders or vinegar-soaked lace. You've earned it. Because what we've uncovered together isn't just a story about filth and frills. It's about the cost of greatness, the price of power, the unrelenting daily theatre of a woman who had to appear immortal, while her body told her otherwise every single hour. Elizabeth wasn't clean in the way we understand cleanliness. She wasn't healthy, she wasn't well-rested or particularly fragrant unless she was drowning in imported oils. But she was disciplined, and that, weirdly enough, became her hygiene. Relentless self-discipline wrapped in velvet and dusted with death-white lead. She ruled not because she was flawless, but because she refused to show the cracks. Even as her body fell apart, teeth rotting, skin weeping, hands trembling, she held her posture. She kept to the rituals. She kept the throne. And now, with the lights low and your eyes heavy, it's okay to let her image drift into something softer. Less sceptre, more slipper, less myth, more mortal. A woman who lived in fear of mirrors and body odour, and still managed to steer a country through some of its darkest storms. You probably won't have to run an empire tomorrow, or hide tooth pain behind a pearl-studded smile. But if you do, maybe just wash your face, maybe skip the lead paint, maybe give yourself permission to not be perfect. Elizabeth never had that luxury. You do. Good night, my friend. Sleep deeply, dream gently, and may your sheets smell only of lavender and not political desperation.